Hello and welcome to the EXP Required podcast where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I'm Jack and I'm joined by Mol.
Hi, how's it going?
We are today going to look at Final Fantasy 1 and 2
The
as our main
OGs.
topic. So I haven't asked you if you're all right yet, by the way. That's how you're all right. We've been talking for like an hour before this, so I don't want the listeners to think I'm rude.
Yeah, no, I'm good. It's been a surprisingly busy week. Lots of work going on. I recently took my dad to see the stage play of Spirited Away up in
Oh, is
the
it
West
good?
End.
Is it good?
It was absolutely fantastic. We didn't have the best seats in the house, wasn't a problem whatsoever. The stage, we could see all of the stage, fantastic set display. The acting was fantastic. The music, it made me just want to go home and rewatch the original Spirited Away. They did a fantastic adaptation of it.
So that sounds really cool. I went to a meetup up in Glasgow to see a Twitch streamer that I know, and also I popped down to the BAFTA Mental Health Summit with Safe in Our World, who I'm an ambassador for, which are a mental health gaming charity, which
Wonderful.
was fabulous. And I stayed over the night in Piccadilly Circus for
Excellent.
88 quid overnight in Piccadilly Circus.
No,
Yeah.
I don't believe that.
Place called Zed Away or something like that. I think it's called Z Well is the name of the hotel. Cannot complain. It was very quiet, very nice, just enough room for me. So yes, Final Fantasy. I also played a bit of Final Fantasy 1 and 2, unsurprisingly. So yes, Final Fantasy 1 and 2. We're going to start with Final Fantasy 1, which is just obviously Final Fantasy. I'm going to ask the typical question I ask, which is, what are your personal memories of this game?
All right. Obviously, as people in Europe, we didn't actually get Final Fantasy, the original, until, what was it, 2002, 2003 that it came
2003,
out?
I've got it written here, yeah.
Right, okay. Which was a fucking long time after the original came out. So, by this point, I'd already played FFs 7 through 9, I think. Had 10 come out at this point? Yeah, 10 had come out,
Yeah,
which
2001,
is just
2.
insane to think about, really, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
10 had come out by the time that we got the original Final Fantasy. The way that I played it was via Final Fantasy Origins, which was the bundle of 1 and 2 for the PlayStation 1, which, yeah, I didn't have a problem with it. It was definitely one of those, like, I recognized the name, I pointed at it, and was like, I'm having that. Wasn't like anything I was expecting it to be quite honest with you. As a kid, it didn't really blow my mind, didn't blow me away. Perfectly reasonable as a game, perfectly serviceable, really, really difficult to follow. Didn't understand exactly what I was meant to be doing at any point in time. Didn't finish it. Didn't finish 2 either, but obviously we'll talk about that in a little bit.
That's going to be an interesting subject too, I'm sure. Okay, so my memory, sort of similar. Yeah, so I played this first on the Origins collections, but it was basically, this is my silly story, which I'd forgotten about until I thought this.
Oh,
My friend, I'd had a friend at like primary school, and I went into secondary school at the end of 2002, beginning of 2000. So like my year 7 was 2002 to 2003. And I'd not fallen out with this friend, but I'd sort of like drifted from him because he was in a different year half, which for maybe the American listeners might not understand what year halves are, but basically you're nowhere near the people you were with before. And he had this game and I wanted to play it. And it was brand new. And I was like, I'll go around his house. My old friend, we're really good friends, aren't we? And I remember borrowing it from him. So that's my memory of first playing it. But I didn't play the actual game properly until the Dawn of Souls re-release on Game Boy Advance, which I got for Christmas 2004, I believe. It was part of we used to go to a Christmas party locally, and Santa used to come out and give us a gift. And I got this from Santa, Dawn of Souls, which was the first 2 games on Game Boy Advance. And I think that, amazingly, from what I've read, it looks exactly the same as the PS1 version, which is quite impressive for I don't think the fidelity of the music is as good, but the graphics and the resolution are the same practically, from what I understand. And the load times are a lot better, because that's one of the things that sucks about the PS1 versions of those games. The load times are pretty poor. But yeah, no, like you, I mean, like they're released out of order. And of course, in the spirit of that, we've done this with this podcast. We've talked about Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, then 10, 10, 2, and 12.
The whole spirit
and
of the
then
franchise.
1 and 2. We just that was deliberate, by the way, for everyone. That literally, we did that for a joke. So yeah, that was my. I think I mean, I was the same when I first played it until I played Dawn of Souls, but I loved it when I played the Dawn of Souls version. The first one on Origins, it was more like, wow, I've played this now. Cool. Love the soundtrack. That's something that I think is worth noting. I think it's one of Nobua's best single soundtracks, or what you want to call it, individual soundtracks. I think it's an absolute gem. So
I don't know if I'd call it one of the best, but there are definitely some tracks that are just unparalleled brilliance.
One of the most
honestly.
iconic. I think, like I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'm biased because I absolutely love the Gulag Volcano music, which is in Final Fantasy 9 as well.
Tracks, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's that one, and finally we got around to talking about the music, because obviously on my first episode we were like, we'll talk about the music later, and we never did. Yeah, there's some other stuff in it as well. I think it's only like 20 tracks or something ridiculous, something really small.
It's really, really small, yeah. And a lot of them are only about like 10 seconds long as well, which always throws me for a loop.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe one of the best is probably pushing it, but I think this sounds really pretentious. It's one of the most Final Fantasy themed games. It's very
I mean, it
bright
set
and
the scene,
happy.
really, didn't it?
It's upbeat and happy. I mean, the next
Yeah.
game we'll talk about. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to not jump between one and two. I think because of the fact they were released together and packaged together. But we will obviously try and talk about one on its own. But like considering two's soundtrack is a lot more somber and depressing. One's is like la 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 la. We're going into the world. It's been remixed a lot more as well.
It has. Recently, I was listening to the 16 soundtrack, and there was one track I was like, okay, right, I recognize this, but not from 16. Where is this track? It's a remix, a somber remix of FF1's Overworld theme for the main villain of FF16. And when I heard that, it blew my mind. It was like, wow, okay, I wasn't expecting that kind of throwback,
Yeah.
which was wonderful, especially considering just how upbeat and like cheerful the main Overworld theme for one is. Like, I love that. It's like one of those things you put on when you're like, I'm gonna go outside, I'm gonna have a good damn day. And you know what? It works every time.
It is very, yeah, I agree with that. It's a very what should we say?
Positive?
Uplifting, I think is the word I was looking for. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. The shop theme's cool as well. I like that. That's good.
The shop theme is one of my favorite tracks across the Final Fantasy soundtracks. Honestly, it fucks severely. There's no other way to describe it. Just severely. It fucks. It's not like it's particularly out of place in the one soundtrack, but it's so just like jarringly, what the hell am I listening to? And like I just can't imagine walking to any kind of store and being like, it makes me think of like old wizards and would you care to buy my wares? Like proper D&D style, really.
I also like how that in various versions of the game, where we talk about different versions of this game in a bit, but like you walk into the shop and it's like the shopkeepers are dancing along to that music when you walk in.
I've been caught doing that in retail jobs once or twice. My favorite memory, not this one specifically, but one of my favorite memories in retail was a couple of my colleagues were helping a customer with something, and Queen was on the radio, and I slid down the aisles, on my shoes, to the surprise of all four people that were standing in that row, and then just started lip syncing along, and they were like, "What the fuck is wrong with this person?"
What song was it?
No, it wasn't "Don't Stop Believing." That's not
Don't Stop Me Now.
Queen. Yeah, it was. Don't Stop Me Now.
Don't Stop Believing by Queen.
Yeah.
That'd be a different vibe, wouldn't it? Anywho, so I mean, like a bit of history about this game, but writing notes for this is very tricky. As I mentioned there, it would be tricky to distinguish between one and two because they were packaged together in the West for the first time, as far as I understand. It's only in Europe for the first time, or the PAL territories, I should say, because I think that includes Australia. The first two games were originally released, or the first game, sorry, was released in 1987 for the Famicom, and then it came out on the NES or the NES, if you're American and like to make acronyms harder to say, and to the 1990. And then I think there was also a re-release in 1994 of the first two games packaged together on the Japanese Famicom as well. So the two games have always been synonymous together, let's put it that way. Origins came out on PS1 in 2002 and then in Europe in 2003. So I think probably you've seen the 2002 against it online when you've looked at it before, because I assumed it was in 2002, but yeah, we got it early 2003. And then Dawn of Souls, as I mentioned before, came out on the GBA, which is basically the same package as Origins with an additional dungeon or two, I think, as far as I understand. It was later released for the PSP with sexy as fuck graphics and music, on the Sony's PSP, which I was envious of because I didn't have a PSP till much later. And then probably on every phone ever made, it's been released. You can probably play it in your car, you can probably play it on your McDonald's menu thing, like they've done with Doom. It's one of those games that's been ported to everything. And of course, the 2021 Pixel Remaster, which is beautiful, by the way. I think it's absolutely fantastic. One thing to note for anyone that may be put off by the Pixel Remaster, change the font. For goodness sake, the font you get in the Pixel Remaster is awful. It's like some horrible, like Times New Roman looking thing.
The font alone has actually completely turned me off from ever buying the Pixel Remaster.
You can change it though to classic font, and it's so much better.
Do you need to mod it to do that, or
nope,
is that something...
you can just go in the menu and change it. Well, you can on the PlayStation 5 version I've got. Yeah, no, the font put me off playing it for a while. Honestly, something so simple as a font ruins the experience. I'm not going to try and sell the Pixel Remasters because they are. The controls good, they're great. I mean, they don't include some of the additional content, but they are great ways to play those early games. So in terms of release and development for Final Fantasy 1, which is very difficult to do, as I say, because there's 8 billion, zillion, million, fulfillion different versions of it, there was a myth that this was essentially Square's final go at things, hence why it's called Final Fantasy. But apparently, that's one of those things that you hear people say all the time that may or may not be true. Apparently, it's because they just wanted FF to be the shortening.
Yes, that was something that I came across in my time doing research as well. It was a case of they wanted FF for the mnemonic. No, that's not the right word. For the initials. And I believe the original title was going to be Fighting Fantasy, which doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well, really. I'm glad they changed it.
Yeah, Final Fantasy just it sounds mysterious, doesn't it?
It
Final
sounds
Fantasy.
cool.
Oh, what's that? I'm playing Final Fantasy 8 million. Oh, okay, that makes no sense. I've also got a note here that says the 1990 NES version was mostly the same with Judeo-Christian imagery and boobs removed.
Yes, that's
That
absolutely correct.
literally sums it up, doesn't it? Oh,
Yeah.
we can't have the Christian imagery or tits. We can't have them in there.
That was, I mean, it wasn't just related just to FF1. They did a lot of censorship through, I think it was up until 6, actually. 7 was the first one that was kind of free of actual genuine censorship with sprites being covered up and like crosses being omitted and things like that.
Oh yeah, I know that there's the Star of David room at the end, isn't there, when you fight Chaos, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, this also came out on the Wonder Swan as well, which is something that I think is a Japanese exclusive. I remember, like back in the day, when I was going through my phase of trying to collect all the old Final Fantasies because I was playing 7, 8, and 9 first, and then getting these re-releases as they came out. I remember thinking, "What's the Wonder Swan? Wow, that sounds really cool." I think it's a Japanese exclusive console. I know that the release of the games was. I'm not sure about that. Whether you know anything more about that?
Wonder Swan Color was a Japanese only console. Yeah.
Right. But that was the first time, from what I've looked at, where the standard Final Fantasy font was used for Final Fantasy
Oh,
1.
really?
Yeah.
Right.
So obviously
Okay.
you got the typical Final Fantasy in black letters with an image behind it. That was the Wonder Swan version was the first time, so that's 2000 for the first
Right,
time that
interesting.
appeared. Because before that, I think it was its own image. Yeah, obviously, like each of the individual Final Fantasies has their own black writing on the white background with a different image. In this one, I think it's supposed to be the warrior. I think just holding a
Yes.
sword. And that
Yes.
appeared. That was the first time it appeared there. So that would have been 13 years after it first came out, which is quite
My
interesting.
God.
Yeah, and now that was 24 years ago. So there's a long
Oh,
time.
don't say it
Yeah,
like
no,
that, Jack, please. You're
sorry,
killing me
it's a while
here.
back. It's a while back. But I've said here many versions of this game, and the differences could fill their own deep dive. So I'm sure we'll go into that at some point. I know that it was influenced by NX's Dragon Quest, which came out at a reasonable amount of time. But
It was inspired by quite a few things, actually.
yeah,
Took inspiration from Ultima Wizardry and First Edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons too, which
yeah,
ties in wonderfully with my non-FF life at the moment. I've joined a D&D group. I've been really enjoying it. I
cool.
didn't realize it was still very Final Fantasy at the end of the day, but then I come back and play FF1 and I'm like, oh, shit, I've been doing this on Saturdays, actually.
Yeah, I know that. Like, we'll go into the gameplay in a second. Funny, that takes us straight into what I'm talking about the gameplay. Very influenced by Dungeons and Dragons, as you said there, incorporating Western RPG design ideas like zombies being weak to fire, and a lot of the monsters being borrowed from D&D specifically. Apparently, the Ochu, or how do you say the Ochu? That's from D&D. Apparently,
Really,
I've
right.
always wanted to dive into the influences between Western and Japanese RPGs and how they've interspersed over the years. And sort of, I mean, obviously, story wise, we talked about Star Wars and the Hidden Fortress in the last episode. Obviously, the stories are influenced West and East a lot, but it'd be really interesting to dive into how RPGs have developed over time because. Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons is clearly. I mean, a lot of people have said that this game is just Dungeons and Dragons in a JRPG form. I think that's probably pushing it a little bit because it's
a bit too simplistic. Yeah,
I know that what again like it was very difficult to dig into exactly which versions of this, and I'm sure people that listen might be able to correct or add to this. But the original game had the Black Mage and the White Mage, or anyone that could cast magic, would use charges. So essentially, they would cast fire or whatever they would charge, and they'd be able to do it maybe 4 times, 5 times, whatever that would be. Which is kind of mimicking the Dungeons and Dragons. I'm no D&D expert, by the way, but it kind of mimics the daily power thing. You can only use a certain power once a day.
yes. So I can actually talk about that a little
Oh,
bit. I'm surprised that you picked the Ochu as the D&D monster here when we have stuff like beholders and mind flayers and shit in FF1, which are to me much more D&D. I was under the
gelatinous
impression that the
cubes.
Ochu
Are they in it?
yeah. They might well be actually. I think the only real unique enemies are Chaos, Warmech, and some of the robots in the Flying Fortress. Everything else is pretty much directly lifted from the enemy handbook.
Is that true?
I have a copy of Yoshitaka Amano's The Sky art book, which covers Amano's illustrations from all the Final Fantasies that had been released at that point. And yeah, the monster art really wouldn't look out of place from D&D handbooks at all. As far as the magic system, there are a limited amount of spells which deplete with each use, and this is pretty much exactly how magic works. As far as wizard spell slots in D&D, you have a certain amount of times that you can cast something per skill level, essentially, and then you need to do a rest to reset those at the end of the day, which is how it worked in the originals. Later on, I think it was across pretty much all the remakes remakes and the new ports that they put together, so the Dawn of Souls, the Origins, and the 20th anniversary versions, they changed it into what we now know as the magic system of
the ether system.
Yes, that's how it is. But apparently we could only hold 3 spells of each level in the original Final Fantasy 1 up to level 6, unless you're a red mage, in which case you could only hold up to 3 spells up to level 5, because red mages can't have shit.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yes.
I think, I mean, yeah, obviously, like, it wasn't massively jarring to me because I'd done a bit of research before playing the Pixel Remaster recently, but the Pixel Remaster goes back to the charge mechanic.
Does it? That's interesting.
Yeah, and I only realized that when I was playing the game, and I threw an ether at the black mage, and it came up with a green 1. And I thought that's not very much, because obviously just to explain the ether system a little bit, obviously the newest, more modern approach of using ethers is basically you'd have MP and HP, and your MP would be charged by ethers, and your mages and your magic users would typically have higher MP. In that instance, in most of the Final Fantasy games, up to 9, as far as I know. But yeah,
MP
no,
here, for anyone who doesn't actually play video games, why listening to this podcast, thank you, but why? MP standing for magic power or magic points as well,
or mana points, depending on the argument.
Points.
Yeah, that's another. That's a deep dive in itself, talking about the different things that we'll do. But I mean, that kind of highlights what we were talking about before, with all the Western and Japanese RPGs influencing each other. It's interesting you mentioned some of the monster designs there. I mean, a lot of them didn't jump off the page for me. I used to play D&D back, I think it was second version or whatever, back in, like, say 2009, 2010, something like that. But like, a lot of my knowledge of D&D, I'm not a particularly massive D&D person. I love it, but I've not found the right crowd to get involved with, basically. But I know that there's lots of like performative D&D nowadays, like, you know, your Critical Role or your Natural Six with Ben Starr in it. There we go, that's my one for the episode. And then
I knew we'd get one in.
And then the OX Venture stuff and stuff like that. They tend to make their own characters and their own monsters and stuff like that, which is kind of like more what I'm into at the moment. So like stuff, the more self-created stuff, which is very interesting, and something to dive into as well at a later date, I'm sure. But yeah, no, it's interesting again, I would love to deep dive and to look into how all this stuff influences each other. But you're quite a big D&D person, aren't you?
I wouldn't say I'm the biggest D&D person in the world. I do enjoy it. I have run a few homebrew campaigns of my own. One was a Fallout setting based one.
Oh, right.
I did a short campaign for my friends, short only because we drifted apart. We just didn't have time to keep on going. But based on the original 1.0 version of Final Fantasy 14, the online game.
Right, yeah.
So there's a lot of potential there for stuff to do. I'd love to pick that one up again someday. But yeah, at the moment, as it stands, I have a group that I play with every other Saturday. And I've been having a great time with them. I play a barbarian called Tiny Dave, and he stands at almost 7 foot tall.
Oh, wow. That's a Tiny Dave that's 7 foot tall. Yes. It's interesting as well. I mean, the again, unpicking something from nearly 40 years ago, oh my God, a game apart.
Jack, you're killing me. You can't say it like that.
It's nearly 40 years ago. It's a game that came out. But I know it's terrifying, isn't it? 37 years old, this game. Yeah. You can customize your characters, or you're forced to customize your characters in this game. Like, so you've got the warrior or the fighter, the thief, the white mage, the black mage, the red mage, the black belt or the monk, depending on translation, are your main characters you can pick. You can pick any combination of 4 of them. So you can, if you're really, really crazy, you can have 4 white mages, which I know is a particular run of this game. I think there's speed runs of that, and you have to name them. You don't get given like a kind of like nameless protagonists essentially in the story, which is something that you might be able to correct me here, but I don't think that reappeared until 10 to an extent, because obviously I know Tidus, whatever you want to call him, like obviously his name, as far as I know, is never mentioned by the voice actors in the game, but his character is unique. But essentially, like, after this, the characters became intertwined with the story and had their own names and backstories and things like that. In this instance, effectively, they are just the Warriors of Light, and you can customize them and eventually make your own story with them, which I think is probably the main D&D influence, maybe not mechanically, but like structurally, because one thing I did note is that the NPCs don't move around in this game. I don't know. I was finding it very difficult to explain this when I wrote it down. So they don't really react to changes, which is kind of probably its weakness as a game. I mean, at the time, obviously, it was a big deal. But like, for example, later on, you go to the town of Melmond, which has been affected by the vampire. And it's like the ground's been eaten and the vampire's been there and, going, I want to suck your blood and a lot of stuff, as vampires do. And you go there and like everyone's like in the town, they're like, oh, you're the Warriors of Light, are you? Oh, the vampire's affecting everything. You beat the vampire. He's a bitch. You take him out in about 2 hits and then go back to the town. And they're still saying the same things. So it's not like the story progression in this game. I've noted down it's a where the fuck do I go type game.
Yes.
It's very much like open plan, make it up as you go along story. So you kind of fill in the blanks of it, which is very D&D,
Yes. It's one of those things where not necessarily you can see the D&D inspiration, but it's the kind of thing that I feel would benefit from having a dungeon master actually explaining stuff or having more than just the opening credits crawl. That guy telling the story of the legend of the 4 Warriors of Light, he could have pitched in, given us a little bit of help, showing us where to bloody go.
Yeah, it kind of makes things very, very frustrating in some senses. I was playing this game, I was really enjoying it, but like getting the flow to move along and understanding why, getting from A to B was quite difficult for a lot of the time. And obviously the main quest, as you appear in Cornelia, you're asked by the king to go into the Chaos Shrine to rescue her from Garland, who's turned against the kingdom of Cornelia. And then the story starts where you got to go and put the 4 orbs and put the 4 orbs, 4 orbs or 4 crystals, depending on what version of the game, and basically bring light back into the world. So you get an objective, an overall objective, but each individual objective you get is it's not really woven into the story that well. You go to a place called Provoker and you liberate the town from a bunch of pirates and take their ship. But there's no real build into the entire narrative of that. I mean, the townspeople really want you to help them save them from the pirates, but there's no like cutscene or anything like that where one of the townfolk people will be like, oh yeah, no, thanks for that. And here's, we were forever in your debt or anything like that, as far as I know. Presumably it's to try and keep in line with the original versions of the games and all the remakes. They haven't changed the script or anything like that. I think it's probably been more authentic to the experience more than anything.
The original Final Fantasy 1 didn't have any kind of cutscenes. It didn't really have anything at all. Going for it is the wrong word to say here, but it was very, very simplistic. It was still groundbreaking at the time, absolutely aware that there is no way that I can really objectively review it properly in 2024, considering that it's been nearly 40 years since it came out. And, times have changed. We're used to a different standard of storytelling now. You can't get away from that. But yes, originally it was a case of, you are these guys, go save the world. Like, okay, what about the bits in between? No, you fill in those blanks yourself and you have a good time doing it. Or you don't, in the case of me, because I hate grinding in video games. That is my number one bugbear, and Final Fantasy 1 is all about grinding.
Yes, it is. Before we move on from that, though, there were no cutscenes in this game. And do you know why there were no cutscenes in this game?
I'm going to have a guess to say that it was the Famicom's limitations, but I don't know.
More the fact that cutscenes did not exist until the same year this game came out.
My God.
The phrase cutscene comes from Maniac Mansion, which was a game that was released on the NES. I think it might have come out on the Famicom, but it was a LucasArts game. You familiar with Maniac Mansion?
I haven't heard that name before, actually, no.
Day of the Tentacle. You've heard of Day of the Tentacle?
I have heard of that,
You must have heard of like Monkey Island, right? And LucasArts.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so the first one they did was Maniac Mansion. Maniac Mansion was a game where you go into a mansion and save your girlfriend with your friends. And every now and then in the game, you would go around the mansion and you're basically trying to avoid the people in the mansion that are trying to find you. And every now and then a scene would play of something else going on within the mansion that would impact the story. Because the idea is that you needed to get there in time to save your girlfriend. Now, within the code of the game, those were called cutscene.
Right.
That's where the phrase cutscene comes from. So there was no such thing as a cutscene until that game came out. So they're kind of can be forgiven for not having a cutscene because they weren't things at that point.
Yeah,
so this probably wouldn't have been picked up from as a reviewer as not having cutscenes. How awful is it? Again, so like you say, for the time it was fine. Moving on, obviously, like in later versions, and I don't know which version this came into first. I think it's probably going to have been the WonderSwan version. But after you liberate Princess Sarah from Garland and rescue, go back to Cornelia and speak to the king, he builds a bridge for you, and there is a cutscene there of the bridge being built. But that was later versions of the game. That was never in the original. So yes, there's a little bit of trivia for tonight.
Wow, that's my thing to learn for the week. That's Do you know what month Maniac Mansion came out? Do you know how soon it came out?
I was trying to surreptitiously look it up while we were talking about it. When you said about cutscenes, I was like, Maniac Mansion. It just says 1987 graphic adventure video game. It was released October the 5th, 1987.
Right, so only a few months.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know how. I know that the word cutscene features in the code, so and that's probably why how it's come into programmers sort of vernacular kind of thing.
Same way that Easter eggs have, really.
Where did the Easter egg come from then specifically? Like, obviously, Easter bunny, like Easter eggs, but.
Right, okay, so from the Wikipedia article here, an Easter egg is a message, image, or feature hidden in software, video games, films, or other mediums, coined in 79 to describe a hidden message in the Atari video game Adventure in reference to an Easter egg hunt. So, yes, you were right.
Very, very interesting, yeah. So, I mean, again, it probably was one of those things that came from the vernacular. I don't know if necessarily, I don't know when the first cutscenes were in Final Fantasy. I think Final Fantasy 2 might have some. We'll talk about that later. Obviously, it does, and certainly in the remakes. I've never played the original version of that game. We'll get to that game later. Let's stop talking about that game too early, Jack. The thing is, it's one of those unfortunate things because I think this game would benefit from a bit of a polish with things like that added in. But I can understand wanting to try and make the experience as authentic as possible, and they've done that with the pixel remasters by returning to allowing you know, having the charge format that we talked about before. So I get it. I totally understand it. And I can, to be honest with you, most people that are playing Final Fantasy from 1987 at this point know what they're doing anyway.
They know what they're getting.
He says that I was a bit stuck the other day. I mean, eventually that's the point. I mean, this is like the game's really strange. I mean, it's there's like a big fetch quest in the middle that, like, I don't know whether it's may have been the first fetch quest. I don't know. You're not really directed on how to do it though, which is a bit weird because essentially you come across, you're sort of trapped within this sort of big lake in the middle of the world. But because of the fact that the encounter rate is too high, you can't really get a sort of like, what's the word, an objective of what you need to do. If someone was to tell you, you need to get out into the wider world, then you would then understand what your first objective was, which would then push you down the path of the fetch quest. Because the idea is you need to get nitro powder or TNT, depending on what version, to blow up the land bridge to get out. That's your overall objective for the first sort of third of the game. But you need a key to get that from somewhere it's locked away. But the Sleeping Prince of Elves has it. He needs to be woken up by the witch Matoya, who has a potion, but she's had her crystal eye stolen. By Astos, the Elf King, he has the eye and he's posing as someone else. So it's like one of those things where you don't know what quest you're on. You're just walking around mindlessly, and they go, "Oh, there's some guy in some keep. Oh, by the way, you've just given me this eye. Okay, what's that for? I don't really understand." It's very easy to sort of like fall out of sequence with this game as well.
So you listing all of those different quests definitely feels like a D&D progression of a group.
Yeah, well, yeah. So again, it's authentic. It's authentic. It's just you can clearly tell what was on the minds of the people doing it. I mean, it's the same later on when you go to the Citadel of Trials, which is a really like weird dungeon where you got to move around loads of teleporters in order to get an item from it called the Rat's Tail, and give that to Bahamut, and he will go, "Well, you're not worthy. I will turn you into slightly bigger versions of yourself. I'm Bahamut."
Verbatim, beautiful rendition.
But you can go and do the trials area first, and then go and meet Bahamut, and you've already done it. So like you don't get the quest. This is what I did this time. I played it. I went to the trials place first, and then went to meet Bahamut, and just went, "Here's a Rat Tail, mate." And he went, "Oh, cool." So like you know, it kind of like, it's a weird one, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to slag this game off too much, but like it feels like a sandbox, but not really. You know what I mean? Like it sort of gives you the keys and hands you the car over. Doesn't explain what you need to do, but also you have to follow a certain path. It's a bit weird.
Yeah, it was nigh impossible for me when I was younger to actually follow along with FF1. I did not finish it. I don't even think I got to about halfway through. I know I did not find the TNT to blow up the bridge. So however many hours I sank into the game, mostly would have been me swearing at the fucking encounter rate. Oh my god, it was endless. And I really I don't enjoy grinding as a game mechanic. It's never been fun or enjoyable to me. So that really did put me off. I would like to really actually sit down, put on, a show or something in the background and give it a fair shake at some point. But it's one of those things that I would need to really devote a fair amount of time to actually doing. I don't want to, is the thing. Grinding is just so tedious that I don't even want to attempt that challenge for myself, which is such a shame because it's a classic. It's history and I like experiencing history, and unfortunately, I'm a 90s kid. I'm not about that life,
You can turn the encounters off in the Pixel Remaster version, which makes it a lot more fun. Because when I played this the other day, funny enough, the encounter rate was 1, especially in the water. I mean, it's not too bad on land, but when you get in the water in the boat and you're trying to work out where you are, it's like, oh, it's some sea monsters. Oh, there's some more sea monsters. Oh, there's some more sea monsters. Oh, there's some more sea monsters. It's like, whoa, this is just completely crazy. What's going on? I think it's also a double-edged sword because you kind of need to level up to be able to fight the monsters later in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't want to say it ruins the experience so much, but turning the encounter rate off makes this a much more enjoyable experience. I will say one thing that did surprise me in replaying it was that the dungeon design is quite interesting in some respects. Some of it isn't. Some of it's pretty dull. But there are a couple of things in it which I don't know how groundbreaking they were at the time, but I assume quite a lot. But I don't know how much of it was involved in the original version, which is another thing that makes it quite tricky. For example, if you go into Gulug Volcano or Gurguro Volcano or whatever it's called, and whatever version you're listening or playing, you get hurt by the floor. The lava hurts you. Sort of like the surroundings take your health off you before you get into battles, which I think is probably a D&D type thing as well. It's kind of like the poison mechanic, isn't it? You know what I mean? The environment you're in is toxic to you in some way. And that
which I've always quite liked as an environmental hazard.
Yeah, it's like a risk-reward thing, but effectively you have to go through the flame to get through, essentially. It's the same in the ice cavern as well, where you go over the spikes. And as I mentioned before, the Citadel of Trials has teleporters which move around again, which were probably quite groundbreaking for the time. So I mean, the dungeon design is better than I thought it was going to be playing such an old game. I mean, I don't think it's amazing, but I think it's actually in some ways it's better than some of the later Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy kind of, I guess, pales in comparison to some things like Zelda, which has incredible dungeon design. I mean, like you wouldn't have a Zelda game without incredible dungeon design. Some of the dungeons within the Final Fantasy games are a little bit dull. I mean, like in terms of their design as a game, I mean, like they look pretty and they fit in with the story. I mean, for example, the fire cavern in Final Fantasy VIII. I love Final Fantasy VIII, but it's just a corridor with fire in it. There's nothing to it. There's no, okay, the story intertwines and what you're doing in there is important, but
I think ultimately it comes down to, other than Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 3, the series has never really been a dungeon crawler.
No.
Unlike Zelda, it's always had much more of an emphasis on the story and the plot and the characters, which, you know, is fine. It's a different genre of game. But totally. I completely agree with you on that.
And I mean, it fits here as well, like you say, because it's more of a dungeon crawler, but also because it's, you know, based off of Dungeons and Dragons. Effectively, it makes sense that would be more focus on that area of the design. You know, I think it's one of the game's strengths, really. I would argue it's probably, other than its soundtrack, which I've already, you know, sung the praises of, I think it's probably its main strength. And of course, it's extremely influential. One thing I will mention, which I'm going to be the first to bring up, in the original game, the design of the in-game battle was quite unique. So having the characters on the right and having the enemies on the left was a unique thing. A lot of other RPGs at the time had that you were faced with a sort of POV image of a monster in front of you. I think Dragon Quest did that. And I think Ultima might have done that as well. Ultima might have been just in person. I can't remember, but I know that it was unique to the games. And apparently, from what I've read, that was to do with the fact that it was trying to simulate like an American football sports type thing where you
really
have like the sports team on one side and you know kind of thing. And of course, you were boxed in, so your players were in a box and the enemies were in a box as well. And one frustrating thing about playing the NES game, if you ever tried to play it, is that if you attack an enemy and that enemy then dies, you will attack the air.
Oh, that would piss me off.
So there's no, it doesn't move to the next enemy. I believe that stayed in the game for quite a while. I think there's an option in some of the versions where you can turn it off or on. But nowadays, that's not a problem.
Why would you keep that?
Why would you keep? No, I know, and it made me stop playing the NES version. I picked it up like probably about 20 years ago at this point, just to play it. You know, let's play the original version. You know, see how it was experienced at the time, and that was enough to kill the game for me, because it's like, oh my god, like you have to get really, really finicky in particular with what attacks you're going to do and what damage they're going to do, and in order to be able to do that, you need to have a guide that tells you what HP all the enemies have got. You know what I mean? I wouldn't say it's game breaking, but I mean that they fixed it now. So
thank God.
Go with that. Four fiends that obviously reappear in Final Fantasy IX, but I think they've done better in Final Fantasy IX, aren't they? They're much sexier in Final Fantasy IX.
They are, even though they have such a brief look in. I mean, all of them are completely lifted from Dungeons and Dragons as well. We've got Liches, Krakens. Question for you: what did you call her? Did you call her Marineth or Carrie?
Malris.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Carrie was what that she was called originally, wasn't it? Yeah.
I think that might have been
in the translation. Yeah.
Limitation on how many words they could.
Maybe the characters you could have. Yeah.
Characters. That's the word I'm thinking of.
I mean, they are kind of like, they're just there as monsters, aren't they? I mean, like, again, my criticisms of this game, which I think I'm not saying they're unfair to criticize, but because we just talked about why they are there and why keeping the artistic integrity of the game there, it makes sense. But there's no like, I mean, you go to each area of the world, there's no like direct link to the particular fiend that's there, other than the vampire that I mentioned before. People talk about the vampire and how he's fucking their days up, but other than that, they just mention the four fiends in general. They don't go, oh, Lich is a bit of a twat, you know, something like that. You know, if you
you'd think that like a 5-headed dragon would fuck up more people's days than the vampire, wouldn't you?
Let's talk about something really tangent. Let's talk about something like Digimon, yeah, right? Digimon.
Oh, Jesus, okay.
So in the first Digimon series, the kids go into the digital world and they go into different areas and they fight fight Devimon's their first monster, and then they move to the world and they meet the Puppet Masters, I think they're called, or the Dark Masters. But each of the Dark Masters has their own little arc, and each Digimon in that area refers to that particular dark person, because that particular monster or Dark Master that's there, because it's having an influence over the area they're living in. So
Right.
it brings you into the world more. Whereas in this, it's just like, oh, you're the White Light Warriors to beat the Four Fiends, are you? It's like, well, if you live in an area within 100 miles or something, you'd only know about the fiends you knew about. It's not like all Four Fiends are flying around the world. You'd know about the ones that were particular to where you were from. So the people that were living near where the Earth Fiends were would be like, oh, you're here to beat Lich, are you? Or something like that. That would make a bit more sense to me. And it's probably maybe that sounds like a dig again. I think I understand why it would probably be something that would be fixed if there was a remake. Let's put it that way, in my opinion, you know.
Yeah, now that you said that, I mean, considering that one of the very few things that you're actually told is like the light from the elemental crystals is fading, you'd think there would be more of a link between the crystals and the Four Fiends as well, considering that they're elementally linked, really.
Yeah, totally. And again, like my bugbear of going back to Melmond and then the ground's still in a mess. It's like, oh, you're here to fight the Four Fiends. If they were to turn around and say the ground's still, because there is a little bit of a link, because when you beat Lich, Malris wakes up. But then it's like there's no real mention of like, oh, the grounds tried to get better, but unfortunately it was stopped by Malris's fire or something like that. You know, it's just something that built the world
something
a little bit better.
In. Yeah.
You know, and again, I understand why it's the way it is. You kind of get the impression that all of the NPCs in this game, I think I alluded to it before, they are locked to a location. You know, there's no. We'll talk about Final Fantasy 2 in a minute, but a lot of those NPCs move around the world and do different things at different points, and you go and meet NPCs in different places. Each of the NPCs in this game are locked in a certain place. Apart from the main villain, Garland, who appears in 2 locations, the rest of them are just, you go back to them and meet them. And I think we talked about the where the fuck do I go type of things. They tried to, certainly in the version I've played, they tried to make it so the dancing lady in Cornelia tells you where to go if you're stuck. She doesn't.
No.
You know, she tells you where to go in, like, she very, very, very briefly. Oh, you need to go and do this, and it's like, well, where the fuck's that? There's also a place, I can't remember what it's called. Actually, you might be able to tell me, but there's a place where there's all these old guys stood in a circle.
Oh yeah, I know the one you mean. I can't think of the name of it, but yeah.
One of them gives you a canoe. What a weird dude. Oh, hello, we're all standing in the circle talking complete nonsense. Here's my canoe. Like, what?
That's spoken like someone who's never met a group of geezers in a pub.
But do you reckon it's like a TGI Fridays and it's that big canoe they've got up in the TGI Fridays? It's a old guy sat around the table and they're like, here's my canoe, you're lol, take it off my hands. I can imagine old geezers sitting around in a circle. That part's not unbelievable. The fact they're in a perfect circle is a bit weird. And they just talk shit. You go up to them and they're like, oh yes, the teacup is full of gravy. And it's like, how does that help me?
Yeah, I've been to that spoons.
I think that area is supposed to be the place you go to find out where the fuck do I go. And you know, you get that in a lot of games. Like I sort of talked about point and click adventure games there before. We mentioned Maniac Mansion. They benefit from hint systems because some of the logic in doing those puzzles is quite difficult. And in some instances, you go to characters and like you start off by saying, "What do I do with this?" And they'll start off by being cryptic. And if you ask them, eventually they start being a lot more specific to things. And that's a standard way that hints and things work in games. Eventually, you get involved in the logic of what's going on. In this, it's like, I've got to go somewhere. And these old men in a circle that are supposedly like spiritual and understand what's going on should be able to tell me, please. Look, here's my canoe, lol. You know, it's just a bit silly.
So I know that the action game Final Fantasy Strangers of Paradise is an adaptation of Final Fantasy 1. I haven't played it myself because I'm aware that it is a Souls-like, and I'm not very good at Souls-likes. I am slowly working my way through Elden Ring with the help of a friend and the Seamless Co-op mod, because that is the only goddamn way that I'll ever be able to play a Souls-like game. Unfortunately, I'm not a very good gamer, which, as you can imagine, limits me in genres like that. But I do know that in Strangers of Paradise, the Warriors of Light have names. They have some motivations beyond just, we walked into a bar and some guy told us to go save the princess. You know, I know that the Four Fiends have more of a look in and characters behind them. I'd be very interested actually in not only playing that sometime, but actually sitting down and comparing the original game with Strangers of Paradise. Maybe that'll be this year's project.
We've probably shit on this game quite a bit, but it is a classic. I did enjoy my time playing it. It's kind of a bit of a mindless bit of fun eventually when you get through, when you know what you're doing, when you get into the swing of things and you realize you've got to take out the Four Fiends, and once you've got the upgrades from Bahamut, it does get a lot easier because you get the airship at that point.
It's just the getting there that's the issue.
Once you get to that point in the game, you can just literally go through each tower individually, and you can get there a lot quicker, and you haven't got to faff around with the encounters. And then you can just, like, you know, grind's probably the wrong word. You just like walk through a dungeon, turn encounters off if you want, just like skip through the monotonous battles and then, fight the enemies. I think it's a bit of a switch your brain off type game in that sense. And I remember playing it when I first played it and feeling that about it and thought it was quite relaxing, in a sense, eventually when it gets to that point. So yeah, it's a good product. Like I say, the soundtrack is fantastic, and it's nostalgic. You can understand why they made Final Fantasy IX when you play this game the way they did, because Final Fantasy IX, obviously we've talked about it in another episode, but I don't know how much we went into the fact it looks over its shoulder a lot. It has references to the previous 8 games.
Yes, and considering that 9 had already come out and been out for so much longer than by the time that this actually came to us in the EU, is, again, I think we mentioned this in that first episode as well, but that's probably a big contributing factor as to why 9 is considered an underdog, so to speak, just because we didn't have the appropriate resources to look back on with the Japanese crowd, which is a shame, really.
In Europe, I mean, we touched upon that as well, didn't we? The fact that I always thought that 9 was the underdog of the 3, 7, 8, and 9 in Europe, and it certainly was in terms of sales, and it certainly was in terms of took a longer to become platinum or in Europe, from my memory. Obviously, the States had Final Fantasy 1, but potentially they would have seen Final Fantasy 9 and saw that it was a throwback to Final Fantasy 1, because that is the main game Final Fantasy 9 plays homage to. Obviously, it mentions lots of other stuff from the rest of the series. There are definite callbacks to all of those games, but it's pretty much I wouldn't say remake, it's a reimagining of Final Fantasy 1 in a different world. And I mean, yeah, I could sing 9's praises all day.
Here we go.
I'd rather play that than 1, but I think I can understand. What I love about that is how they made the thief the main character. I think I mentioned that as well. Like in this, the first character you select is the fighter. And I think it's probably the character.
Kind of set the tone for the rest of the franchise, really, didn't it?
Yeah, and I think so. And of course on the logo we talked about before, the fighter or the warrior is the one that's on there. But yeah, I just think it was cool how they kind of like they subverted expectations and made the thief the main character. I think that was really cool. Yes, let's move on from that. Is there anything else you'd like to add on Final Fantasy 1?
Yes, actually, before we move on to talking about 2, I know we mentioned earlier about the battle system and how you've got different magic slots and how they go down. The names of a lot of different spells, all spells in the game, were limited to 4 slots only for 4 characters. So there were some very strange words that were included in your magic lists. And I've written down a couple of these. Harkening back to the very first time that we ever did anything together, our little quiz, I'm going to ask you if you can guess what some of these spells are. Okay. Based on just the 4 letters. So we'll start with an easy one here. We've got lock, L-O-C-K. Do you know what that is?
Is that supposed to be like stop?
That's what I thought as well. It's not. The actual translation of it comes out to focus. The original katakana was shape, and it reduces the evasion of an enemy, which, okay, sure. We have alit or alit, A-L-I-T. What do you think that one might do?
Alit. Is it supposed to be like lightning of some form?
Yes.
Yeah, lit, like light.
So that one's lightning resistance. You have lit for the actual bolt spell, and then alit for resistance. Fade, F-A-D-E.
That's got to be like blind or something like that, isn't it?
That's what I thought. It's holy. It is FF1's holy.
Really?
And rub is death in this game.
Rub.
Now, harkening back to what we said earlier, this was because of the censorship. Nintendo of America's policy prohibited games from using any of Judeo-Christian imagery or reference to death. So this is why churches no longer featured crosses, and the death spell was renamed. And I actually did a little bit of digging into why it was renamed Rub. Obviously, they only had 4 characters there, but it specifically, the term comes from to be rubbed out of existence. To be rubbed out as a phrase in that meaning is used from the 14th century onwards, and for a sense of being killed is actually used from the 18th century in American English. So it was a pretty decent choice considering the character limitations that they had at the time.
Going to invoke another thing I talked about before, which is
yes, I did also encounter that on quite a few different forums as well, and everyone going, yeah, I didn't think it meant rubbed out in that sense. Yeah, no, we know you didn't, heathens.
Yeah, that's interesting. I will invoke something else that I talked about from another episode, was Dragon Ball Z. So when Dragon Ball Z came to the States, there was a similar issue where they couldn't refer to death. Not being able to refer to death in Dragon Ball Z is like, there's no point watching it, because they die, come back to life all the time. Death is no consequence in that series. What is at the beginning, and eventually it becomes a joke. Yeah, they had like phrases like send you to the next dimension, which is an interesting thing which you may be familiar with. And there's like, I will send you to the next dimension, as opposed to saying I will kill you.
The Shadow Realm.
Yeah, the Shadow Realm was used in Yu-Gi-Oh! But also the main one, which I love, and actually was again art artistically quite impressive for the time was that there was a point where Goku goes into hell and meets these two strange demons that have the word hell written on their t-shirt, and they needed to censor it somehow, so they censored it by changing it to HFIL, which was the home for infinite losers, right? So on the internet, the phrase "what the hiffle" came out quite a lot, and it is synonymous of that time. So that's something that, like, I mean, that's obviously quite common to things in certainly in the States. I mean, I think by the time it got to Europe, we didn't really care as much about that stuff, unless of course it's, you know, I think the boob stuff we would have gone with, because, you know, we can't have them because they, you know, can't have them in games.
No. That's corrupting our children, and
yes, corrupting our children. Yes, we can't have
so I do have one other thing to mention here as well. A couple of other things. Number one, the biggest famous quote from Final Fantasy 1. Do you know what that one is?
The biggest famous quote from Final Fantasy.
It's like the only line that anyone really knows. I believe it was used in Dissidia of all things as well.
The only thing I'm thinking of is "Here lies Link" from the
That's not the one that I was thinking of, but that's a good point, actually.
Okay.
No, it's from Garland specifically. "I, Garland, will knock you all down," as a, you know, phrase before the very first battle with him, which is kind of like a, you're gonna tip me over, you cow tipping, Garland? What's going on here? There is a fantastic website called Legends of Localization. I don't know if you've heard of that at all.
I haven't, but it sounds like my alley.
It's a wonderful website. I highly recommend that you and all the listeners check it out. They have an article talking about the origin of this phrase and how in the original Japanese text, the word used for knock down is kechirasu, which translates very, very literally to kick and scatter about. So in contexts like this, it would usually mean something like to devastatingly defeat or to rout, something like that. So what likely happened, they say, is that a mix of a non-native English speaker, an uncommon Japanese word, and a synonym with multiple translations kind of all got mixed together to being a bad guy whose terrifying threat is, "I'll knock you down." The PS1 version, Origins, had it replaced with "I shall take on all of you," which is better, but still, it doesn't feel threatening enough to me. Sorry, Garland, you can walk the walk, you can't talk the talk.
He has a sexy design, doesn't he?
He really does.
I think his design's better in this than it is in Final Fantasy 9. I mean, as much as I love Final Fantasy 9, I think him as an old man robot looks a bit weird.
It does, doesn't it?
In this version, he looks really, really sexy.
Garland's helm is it's one of those silhouettes that you can't help but recognize.
No, it's fabulous. Better as a knight than as an old creepy old man robot. I think as well. I mean, obviously we'll talk about Final Fantasy 4 in another episode, I'm sure. But there's like we talked about the translation changes. Obviously, as time's gone on and there's different versions of the games have come out, they've made the translation better. But I remember in the first intro when you're playing as Cecil, let's go for Cecil.
You said Cecil.
When you're playing as him, he's attacked by monsters on the Red Wings, and he says "damn" in the version I remember. But in the more modern version, he says "damnation." And it just sounds a little bit more like posh. It's a little bit like, okay, I don't know if that fits as much as I think it should do. But if there's things like that where things change, and again, I don't mind changes like that make it better. But I mean, it's
always interesting to see how media changes over time and how like the common perception of it changes. Especially, and again, we will talk about Final Fantasy 4 at another point, because that is one of the best games in the series, in my humble opinion.
No, it is brilliant.
Knowing that 4's world is very feudalistic, so for them to actually move towards using that language kind of rings true of like Evilis's localization.
Yeah, totally.
It's very interesting to look at that kind of stuff. So the only other thing that I am going to bring up, and this will just be a brief thing before we segue into Final Fantasy 2, because I know we have other things to talk about as well. Have you ever heard of a webcomic called 8-Bit Theatre?
Yes, I might be mentioning 8-Bit Theatre later.
Wonderful, excellent.
As a wildcard subject.
8-Bit Theatre, for those not in the know, was a webcomic that spanned from 2001 to 2010. It was based on the original NES sprites of Final Fantasy 1, very loosely based on the plot of FF1. Follows your cast of fighter, black mage, thief, and a red mage as they unwittingly save the world, shall we say. Absolutely wonderful webcomic. I highly recommend reading it, but maybe only a few pages at a time. I don't know about you, but the 72 DPI hurt my eyes, and the NES palette was... I've never been able to play the original versions of Final Fantasy 1 or 2 purely because the NES palette doesn't agree with my eyes, unfortunately. It's too harsh. So even rereading 8-Bit Theatre, it's a bit of a stretch for me sometimes.
8-Bit Theatre will return later in this episode. I will talk about that later. But yes, no, I agree with quite a lot of that so far. But I'm glad you brought that up. I thought you might. Okay, so moving on to Final Fantasy 2. Now, we've talked about Final Fantasy 1. Naturally, the next game to talk about is Final Fantasy 2, which came out in 1998. Interestingly, it came out less than a year later. It was like 11 months later. first, before we move into it, what's your personal history with Final Fantasy 2? Is it pretty much the same as 1 with the Origins collection?
Pretty much the same as 1, yeah. I think I had a little bit of an easier time with 2, funnily enough, mostly just because there was more direction to follow than there was in 1. Not a whole bunch more direction, but enough for me to not be completely lost at the first turn. But otherwise, yeah, it was just a case of, oh, this is included in the collection. I might as well sit down and play this as well.
Yeah, so I feel the same. So I got this with, again, I played it briefly on the Origins collection, and then with the Dawn of Souls thing. My memory of this was that I didn't play much of this game. But from having to go at it again and looking and researching for this episode, I remember most of it. And I think it's because what I was doing was, and I think it was very easy to do on the Game Boy Advance version, is flipping between 1 and 2 quite a lot. Probably because I was craving a bit more story that I didn't get in 1. Because my memory is that I played 1 all the time, but actually I think I played 2 a lot more, like I say. So yeah, like I said, 1988 this came out on the Famicom in Japan, and it wasn't released in the rest of the world until 2002 on the Origins collection. That was the first time it appeared in the rest of the world, other than maybe a dodgy emulator ROM you might have had back in those days. And I would, again, we mentioned 8-bit theater there. Some of the sprites from Final Fantasy 2 appeared in various webcomics and stuff like that, but we'll talk about that later. Just a bit of a teaser for you there. Dawn of Souls came out a year later, as I mentioned, and also PSP super duper sexy remaster, which is probably the best version of that game, I'd imagine, from what I understand. So this is an interesting one because it's the first game that has a man called Sid in it. It also introduces chocobos. It eliminated the boxes around the battle, which we talked about before, and the sort of sports thing, and it gives you the illusion that you're all right there, and it looks a lot better, I think.
Yes.
One of the notes I've got here, and this is, I mention it now because it's right at the beginning of the game. Obviously, the sort of overarching story of this game is a lot more detailed than Final Fantasy 1. In fact, there is a story here, so that it's considerably more detailed. You start the game running away from an attack on a town or city called Finn. What is fabulous about this game, and I will sing its praises now, as we mentioned in the last segment about cutscenes and stuff like that. Obviously, a cutscene was a way of making the game feel a lot more cinematic in a sense. It makes things feel less like you're just pushing buttons and making an input. Here, there's an interesting bit where you're playing a battle. You're in a battle and you're fighting against Dark Knights that are chasing you right at the beginning of the game, and you can't win it. But it's within the
unwinnable battle.
But it's within the engine, so you can attack, or you can have the illusion that you can attack those enemies. Which I think I don't know if it's the first time that was done, but it's certainly, even playing this back in 2002. I remember thinking that was, or 2003, sorry. I remember thinking that was really cool because it was frustrating because I wanted to beat the battle. But showing you how you interact with the game as a character, this is the place you're going to be doing battle. You're not good enough yet to take on the game, which instantly as a piece of game design must have been unique in 1988.
I can't imagine it wouldn't have been.
No.
And honestly, even as a piece of storytelling, starting something not just in media res, which is kind of, I don't want to say overplayed because it is a good way of grabbing attention, but having it not just be in media res, but in battle as well is a very, very ballsy thing to do, honestly. It immediately grabs you, the fact that it's unwinnable, and not just unwinnable, but like you have 32 health at the beginning of the game, and they're doing like 400, 500 damage a piece to you. Like, oh my god, mine's absolutely blown. Like, that terrified me as a kid, actually.
No, it frightened me as well. And also, I mean, again, with the spooky soundtrack as well, and especially actually if you played the PS1 version, something we didn't mention, which I knew we would jump back between 1 and 2 quite a bit in this episode because they're synonymous together, is the CG cutscenes that were put into the Origins version of the game.
Yes.
So the CG cutscene in the first game is a bit lame. It's just some guy with a sword going "whoa," and it's a bit, it looks very pretty, but doesn't really have much context.
Doesn't tell you anything.
But the cutscene at the beginning of the Final Fantasy 2 is pretty much this CG rendered cutscene where the entirety of Finn's burned down by the Empire.
It really does feel like seconds before the actual battle starts, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's terrifying, and it's all. I think as well, it might be the first time there's technically voice acting in a Final Fantasy game as well, because you can hear the sort of like cries of the characters. They don't speak and say any and have any dialogue, but they will and things like that come out of them as well. I remember that being quite a big deal at the time as well. So that was cool. We can jump into the interesting part of it. Here's a question for you: do you like this game?
I do, actually.
Yeah, I like it as well.
I think that its criticisms are well deserved. I think maybe a lot of its criticisms are a little bit too harsh. The fact that it is a flawed piece of work, but I think there is an awful lot going for it, which doesn't get the focus that it deserves.
I agree.
Actually.
Totally agree.
2 is wonderful. 2 set the scene for what we know as Final Fantasy.
Totally.
1 and 3 are iconic in their own ways. Obviously, 1 started the franchise, and 3 then continues and improves upon what came before. But 2 did I mean, to introduce the idea of actually having a proper protagonist to us rather than just like, you can name whoever. It has a plot, it has Sid, it has chocobos. It does so much that is just absolutely emblematic of Final Fantasy that I kind of really can't. It has a special place in my heart. It might not
Yeah,
be
me
top
too.
dog ever, but
No.
it's very special to me. I think the soundtrack is wonderful. I think the plot is worthy of a Final Fantasy title. It's not the best. It will never be the best, but I think it gets undue hate.
I totally agree. And we mentioned before, I can't remember what episode it was. I'm losing track of which ones, but you mentioned before about 8 being it was probably in our first episode where you mentioned about 8 being considered the underrated one. And you mentioned where's the love for 2 and things like that. We'll talk about the elephant in the room. Basically, it's the leveling system, which is the thing that decides this game for a lot of people. Yeah. So this is around leveling up certain attributes. So the more you use things, the better you get at it. So if you use more magic, the stronger you get with using magic. If you hit more, you get more hit points. Interestingly, as a sort of tangent on that, this had an exploit in the older versions before the GBA versions. This exploit still existed within the Origins version, which I didn't know, where you could like queue up an attack or queue up something you were going to do and then back out from it, but you still got the buff, the stat boost from it. So it was very easy to break the game in that sense. Very like the potion trick in
the W item glitch in 7.
The W item glitch in 7, but it's more like the potion glitch in Pokemon Yellow. Do you know which one that is?
No, I don't. I've heard of it, but I wouldn't know how to activate it.
In Pokemon Yellow, I mean Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, Green, and all those, the first gen Pokemon games are notoriously very buggy. But there's an interesting tangent here. Pokemon Yellow is the one that was adapted to be closely related to the Pokemon anime. And the idea was that you had Pikachu following you around in that game, right? Now, in order to get the other 3 starters in the game, I don't know how much of a Pokemon person you are, which are Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, you could get them all. Yes, I'm a big Pokemon fan. You could get them all in the game. Originally, you could only pick one of them in Red and Blue and Green in Japan. But of course, in the anime, you get all of those. Ash gets all of those creatures, so you need to get them in the game. The way you get them is by making your Pikachu feel more affectionate for you. Now, in order to get Pikachu to feel more affectionate for you, there's certain things you can do. If you let him get attacked a lot and don't heal him, he starts to hate you. So you talk to him and he just like sulks and he's upset with you. And basically there's like a little, you click on him as he's behind you and like a little face of him comes up like not looking at you or like pulling a tongue at you or something like that, which is really, really cute looking back at it. Now, the way you get him to love you is you can exploit it by feeding him a potion. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work because if he's got full health, you can keep poking him with the potion and eventually you do it about 30 times, he loves you. And then you can get the other Pokemon. So it's an exploit. And of course, it's not particularly well programmed because the fact is that I don't know how you're supposed to make him love you other than doing that, basically. Like it's one of those things where you just basically like allow your Pikachu to get hurt so you can cure him. No, just like exploit the fact that the game's not programmed that well. So yeah, it's the same as that. And that disappeared later on in the different versions where it was harder to do that, which probably made the game a little bit harder because I'm pretty sure that if you wanted to just play the story, you would exploit the hell out of this game and just power up and level up to the level you could and just enjoy the story for what it was. Because I think, like I say, gameplay wise, it's very similar to 1, but also with that leveling system being completely different than 1.
In no form is the battle system great. I'll say that for starters. Like, it's very in keeping with the spirit of Final Fantasy, and I know this is something we talked about before about the constant innovation and everything is completely new. And Final Fantasy 2 does it with the battle system, which I think is honestly a point in its favor. It tried something new and it didn't work. But the battle system is it's made harder by the fact that at least in the NES and the PS1 version, when one attribute raises, another one decreases, which just adds a whole layer of difficulty. So if your spirit goes up, your strength goes down. If your strength goes up, your intelligence goes down. Like, it makes sense, but it's counterintuitive from like a game system kind of point of view, you know?
I totally agree.
I will say, however, everything that goes into like the abilities increasing when you continue using them and stuff like that is very similar to apparently stuff that happens in the Saga series, which was actually, I don't know if it was headed or if he was just the executive producer or director or whatever, but the same person who worked on Final Fantasy II's battle system specifically, a man by the name of Akitoshi Kawazu. So it makes sense that those two systems would be similar. And you know what? Fair play to him for thinking, actually, I think this works well enough that I'm going to transport it over to a completely different thing when I leave Square. Like, no one can say the man doesn't like what he does. I did do a little bit of research into the general goings on in Final Fantasy II, and I believe there was an interview with Kawazu-san at some point where someone was like, what do you think Final Fantasy would have been like if you'd stayed with the company? And his response was just straight up, it wouldn't be popular. You know what? Fair enough, mate.
Yeah, well, Saga are the sort of quirky, unique weird games, aren't they? They have their place. They have their place. That sounds awful. They have their place at the bottom of the shelf. No, no. I think I've played like maybe a couple of them or one of them. There's a weird roulette one, isn't there, somewhere?
It's one of those series that I've heard of constantly, and I've never actually played any of them.
Yeah, no, I'm sure I've played. I'm sure I've played one or one that was. Oh no, hang on, wasn't Final Fantasy Legend a saga game or Final Fantasy Adventure saga game or something?
Something like that.
Yeah,
yes,
it's probably the one I've played, and I know I've seen people talk about the roulette wheel game. That's a bit weird. It's Romancing Saga, I think it is. Anyway, that's something to dive into at some point. But I mean, like we talked about before, we talked about two things: the fact that Western and Japanese RPGs have influenced each other over the years, and it would be nice to see how that's happened as well. And you mentioned the Souls-like as well, but interestingly, the way that the Souls-like games, but certainly Dark Souls that I've played, you level up certain attributes as you go.
Yes.
Now, what's better with that is you can choose which attributes you level up by getting a certain amount of points or souls in that instance. I've never actually played Skyrim, but I believe Skyrim's similar as well.
Skyrim is incredibly similar. I would say that Skyrim is much more similar than the Souls games, which use a specific, you put your souls or your points into whichever attribute you want. Skyrim works more like 2 in that the more you use something, the more points you get in that level, and then it levels up. However, unlike Final Fantasy 2, Skyrim actually has levels. Final Fantasy 2 has no levels whatsoever, which is such a departure from everything else in the series.
It's interesting because I've obviously I played the GBA version the most. You might know exactly, but I believe in some of the versions that like your HP levels over time it makes it so like something like that, like it's not impacted by, because I think in one of the versions you can sit there and hit each of the party members and then their HP goes up, but I believe in some of the versions they fixed it where every other attribute happens whether you attack someone or do something, but the HP naturally goes up over time. I believe. I don't know though.
I am not aware of HP being one of those things that changes over time. Honestly, punching my own party members in the face never worked for me. I don't know if that was a case where that was taken out of the Origins version, or if my game just didn't work like that, or if I just hated grinding enough, because
probably what it was.
2 is another game where you need to really, really grind, and you need to know what you're doing ahead of time.
It's far worse than this one. Because Final Fantasy 1, you can pretty much customize your party from the beginning. But if you were to say make your party a certain way, you can pretty much, if you have like 4 fighters or whatever, you can just press X or press A or whatever, just hammer the way through that game a lot easier than you can with 2, because of course it is that much more customizable based off what you do. Naturally means you've got to grind more.
I think the most annoying part of 2's leveling thing for me is that you're almost punished for doing something that is against I hesitate to use the word class, but it's the only thing that I can think to use in this sense. So if I want to set, say, Furion up as a fighter, wonderful, not a problem. But if I do anything that isn't a fighter's attribute, I'm going to be punished for it, whether that's, his HP going down or his spirit going up and then something else going down. Like it's at no point in the game is this ever explained to you either, which is my biggest bugbear. Like, it would be one thing if the game gave you a little tutorial or told you in some menu or another.
It doesn't just let you get on with it, doesn't it?
This is it, but it doesn't do that at any point. And Origins doesn't do it. The Pixel Remaster doesn't do it. It's just counterintuitive, and it makes it very difficult to play and very difficult to advocate for.
As a game, yeah. I mean, as a story though, which is probably the next important point. But before we move on to the story, which is far more interesting, there's also the fact that this is the first game to feature the back row for characters. So you can put them in the back row and make them resist physical attacks. Interestingly, with the back row stuff, can you do that in Final Fantasy 8? I don't think you can.
No, actually, now
can you do it? I think you can do it in 7.
You can do it in 7.
9. You can definitely do it in 9. I think you can't do it in 8.
There's definitely a defend option, but no, I think you're right. I don't think
there's no back rows. That's really interesting. 8 would be an interesting comparison with this game mechanically as well, because of course, do you know, putting you on the spot, whether the characters in 2 are blank slates or not when they start? Or do each of them have higher stats in certain areas and stuff like that?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I want to say they are blank slates, but I'm not 100% sure on that, actually. I can't imagine that. I feel like if they had different starting attributes, then there would be min-max reviews that I would have seen over time on. But I've never seen anything like that. So that's why I'm assuming that they're completely blank from the get-go.
Probably are. The other thing to mention is the keyword system in this game.
Yes.
Which I never really got. I mean, I think the idea was that it was used to bring in the limitations, the fact that you wanted to have a far bigger script with a far more dialogue to talk to different characters. But basically, you get keywords in this game, like Wild Rose, which is the password for the resistance. And you're given certain keywords that you need to use and give to certain NPCs within the game. I like the idea, and it's funny enough, it's in keeping with what we mentioned before. Not sure if Squaresoft or Square Enix or whoever has ever mentioned specific influence from from adventure games. We talked about the cutscene before, which clearly influenced pretty much every game that has a cutscene, which is most of them, except for maybe puzzle games. But even puzzle games have got flipping cutscenes. So interestingly, that ties in with the adventure game tree logic stuff that was happening at the time. It was a big thing at the time. Don't know if it was influenced by that, potentially, because of course you put a word in and then you can go down the tree of what you need to do to be able to speak to different characters. I think from memory, it doesn't really serve the way you want it to, because effectively you just go around to random NPCs and just keep throwing words at them.
I don't know about you, but that's how I do most of my real life dialogue.
So
how are you doing today? Wild Rose.
Yeah, well,
brilliant. Get out of the store.
Yeah, let's do that next time we're in public. So I mean, we're again trying to push the RPG style of things and push things forward. And again, really good ideas that were implemented a lot better later in different games. But probably a very influential title. I'd be interested to see, like I say, whether these Western RPGs you mentioned before, like your Dark Souls and your Dark Souls is a Western RPG, right?
I believe FromSoft is a Japanese IP.
I was thinking of Skyrim when I said Western. Sorry.
Oh, they should make Elder Scrolls 6 a Souls-like. That's my hot take of the week.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I meant that. Yeah, it's certainly not what you'd call a traditional JRPG. I think it's more influenced by Western. Yeah, it's difficult. Where does it start? Where does it begin? Where does it end? You know. Okay. Anyway, on to the story.
Before we move on to the story very quickly, it's very interesting that you say that it is influential. I do actually agree with that. You know, there's no way that something that came out less than a full year after the original Final Fantasy could not be as influential. But 2 is consistently the worst selling of all of the titles in the franchise. I was checking sales data. The original game only sold, and this only goes for Japanese units, because obviously it didn't come out worldwide until 2002, 2003. The original game only sold 800,000 units versus Final Fantasy 1's original year, which had 1.3 million units, and Final Fantasy 3, which had 1.4 million. And those are just the original games. Those don't include ports or remakes or anything like that. 2, including ports, which I believe there were 10 ports overall for Final Fantasy II, 3 of which have been since delisted. That was the Wii network, the original mobile games, and the original iOS and Android ports. Including all of those, only 2.4 million total units, including the Pixel remaster, by the way, have ever been sold of Final Fantasy II, which is a startlingly low number, honestly, for a franchise of this repute.
Yeah, totally. I wouldn't mind if I made a game that sold that many copies. But yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah,
agree
right.
with you in principle. Absolutely. Really interesting now. I mean, it's probably because it's been given this Dark Horse status. What's interesting about what you just mentioned there about sales figures is that obviously we talked about Final Fantasy VIII before. Any excuse to talk about Final Fantasy VIII, that doesn't have the same issue with sales. It's one of the best-selling Final Fantasy games, 8. Like if you look at the chart, if you look at the chart, it's not towards, obviously 7's the top. I believe, I might be wrong, you might have more data than me, but it's towards the top. Final Fantasy VIII. It's far, far more popular than it's given credit for.
Give me just one moment, because actually,
there's definitely a chart. I'm pretty sure. I think it's pretty sure it's higher than you'd think. It's one of the more popular ones. Yeah, it's probably worth. Well, now I've mentioned it, it's probably worth actually having some data to back that up.
Overall, 11 million units sold. Just the original PS1 game from 1999, that was 8.6 million units sold. That's including Japan and overseas.
But how does that compare to the other games? I'm sure there's like a chart somewhere. It's interesting with 8 as well, because 8 was the least ported one, I believe, because it was, they had lost the source code, so it was only re-released officially when they did I think they did a Steam version, and then they did the remaster version, which came out in 2019.
Just seeing the units sold worldwide total for all versions of Final Fantasy VII. This isn't including the remake series. No. Do you want to have a guess at the number?
It's very high.
It's very high.
40 million or something.
A bit lower. 24.4 million units sold worldwide. That's my mind can't even wrap around that number, actually. Wow. Okay. Right. Off the sales data.
Yeah,
let's
off the
go
sales
on to the
data.
story.
But anyway, yeah, let's move on to the story. Like tangential talk about Final Fantasy VIII, which is just my favorite thing. So the way I've written the story, we'll go into the detail in a second, but I've written this as like Star Wars meets the Chronicles of Narnia.
Chronicles of Narnia is an interesting
because
one.
of the 4 characters. The fact you're in the snow a lot in this game, and there's beavers.
There are beavers.
Mr. Beaver. You meet Mr. Beaver in this game, yeah. And he just wants an excuse to make that impression. Yeah, we mentioned before, but there's a lot more of a depressing OST in this game. Like the vibe of this game is dark as hell, by the way.
It really is. Honestly, I think 2 would probably really benefit from being remade.
Yes.
Not just like ported or remastered, but actually remade from the ground up. I think it would probably do really well. Similarly to what you were talking about earlier, the very first scene when you're dumped into the battle with the 4 Dark Knights, that which absolutely blew my mind. And then you wake up in Altair with Hindu and Min looking after you. The very first moment where I kind of had to really stop as a kid, like even as a kid, was stepping out of of Altair into the main world
Yeah.
and hearing that overworld theme and just how slow and somber it was. Two's overworld theme is honestly a genuine work of art to me.
Yeah,
Like it's beautiful.
Makes the world feel empty, doesn't it?
It really,
It
really
makes it
does.
kind of has that everyone's frightened to go out mindset to it. You know, it's kind of like, this is going to sound really weird, kind of how I felt when I went out into the real world for the first time during the pandemic. Had that
No,
vibe.
I completely understand that. Actually,
like that kind of like this is a different place we're in now. Everyone's petrified of going anywhere near anything else. We're all stuck in our own little areas because this oppressive empire is stopping us from doing anything. Which that like I said, that piece of music sums that up really, really well. And also as well, the premise of this game, and obviously we talk about the actual story. So the idea of this is the Emperor of Palamecia summons demons from hell to dominate the world. So it's not that deep a concept, but essentially Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon are the main 4 characters in this game,
and the fourth character of the game disappears after the first fight, which is
Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah, okay, you know what? Actually, I'm seeing it now.
He's Edmund. He's Edmund. Anyway, so they're orphaned when the Emperor attacks their hometown of Fynn, and they escape to Altair, like you've mentioned. But like I say, Leon is gone. So the Wild Rose Rebellion takes them in, but won't let them join because they need to prove themselves worthy, which is where things really change from a narrative perspective from Final Fantasy 1, because as I mentioned in one discourse we had, you don't really impact the NPCs and the NPCs don't really impact you. You just go somewhere, there's an NPC there, you chat to them, they may give you an item and you move away and go and use it somewhere else and there's no impact. Here, you've got to prove yourself straight away. You're not the fated warriors of light that are sort of here to save the world and you're part of the prophecy. You're stupid kids that don't know what you're doing. And it's like, you know what? So you go back to Fynn. Well, actually, to be fair, you technically got told to go home and you've got no homes. But you go back to Fynn off your own back and meet Prince Scott of Kashoon, who's dying. And he tells you he tells them that Count Borgen's betrayed you. Count Borgen, what a dick. And he wants to encourage his brother Gordon to take up the mantle, and that he loves Hilda but don't tell her, which is such a gripping story thing. I remember that from being younger, like basically, I love this woman, I can't tell her, but don't tell her. It's like, well, why did you tell us? It's like one of those things where on the face of it, you could joke and say, what was the point in you telling me that, and make a bit of a meme out of it. But actually, like, that's heartbreaking. Because he's effectively confessing something to people that will never tell anyone else. And the weight of that for basically kids that have lost their home, that's an incredible weighty thing to place on the shoulder of some young people.
I think it really fits in with the overall themes of FF2 as well. Courage and personal sacrifice in order to say it's the good of the people over the good of the individual, to me, is the ultimate story. And that kind of is just the perfect little microcosm of, I could let this woman know that I love her versus it's better for her if I just die.
Yeah, but it's the fact that he didn't keep that to himself. He entrusted that knowledge to them, basically just teaching these kids life sucks.
Yeah.
Like, and this is what happens. You might be in this situation. You basically, what he's saying, in a probably not completely consciously, you might end up in the situation yourself where you won't be able to tell your loved ones how you feel. Don't let it happen to you. Is exactly what he's saying. And that's a really deep thing, a massive jump up from the last game. It's like, whoa, what on earth is this? And of course, the narrative thing is that he gives his royal ring over. He gives his royal ring over to you, and you then give it to Hilda, and she then realizes who it is, and then you prove yourself worthy, which is like, that's such a different narrative than you're the fated warriors of light, you're going to take on the save the world, which might be actually why this hasn't done as well, this game, because it's a lot more uncomfortable, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like in all the other Final Fantasy games, like you're kind of like, so again, even the first game, you're the warriors of light. The third game, you're the warriors of light. In Final Fantasy 4, you're essentially the main character. Okay, there's lots going on in that game, but you're the warriors of light. In the Final Fantasy 5, you're definitely the warriors of light. 6 is similar to 4 in that sense, where it's like, you have your individuals that build into the broader narrative, but they are essentially fated characters by their upbringing in some way. 7's the same, obviously, like they're a resistance group or a terrorist group, as we talked about before, but they also have their own link to the broader structure of society. Same with 8. Significantly, you are pretty much told you're going to go and be the warriors of light without, not quite the warriors of light, but you know what I mean? Similarly with 9, but this one is like, the main cast have all got to prove their worth. Not one member of the main cast is part of the status quo, and there's an outsider. They're all the same, which is just, probably the only entry in the series that I think is like that. I know 16 dabbles with that as well, a little bit.
It still doesn't feel like it's on the same same wavelength.
Because Clive is a prince, so it's like he's kind of like a cast out prince, like an Aragorn type character. You're the actual king. You need to have the return of the king. Whereas these kids are just nameless
Kids.
individual kids
Yeah.
that have to prove themselves. No one has got their back except them until they prove it. And that's a theme that the series should probably play with a bit more.
Yeah, it's like you said, 2 is very dark, and
Yeah.
I really think it would benefit from having more emphasis put on that, and maybe
Yeah.
in a sense of like, yes, the world is dark and things really really suck, and like the world is burning down, and this guy's summoning actual literal demons from hell just cuz. But it's one of those things that I really feel like if it had the chance to explore and talk more about these kinds of things with these characters, explore the themes a little bit more in depth, it would do really well. It's not that dark and melancholic stories are underappreciated. I mean, there's plenty of them going around. Look at Game of Thrones, look at Dark Souls, look at Elden Ring. Like, these are all really tragic stories ultimately, and they're not unloved, not by any sense of the imagination. Like, let's bring some of that love over to 2. Come on, I'll be 2's biggest stan until I die.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, it's really interesting how people resist this kind of storytelling as well. I mean, I know Star Wars usually comes up. I've talked at length about, well, not at length, but I've touched upon the fact that I get a bit upset around the discourse around Star Wars because you get this kind of gatekeeping going on. But you're not a real fan if you like this one, or like, I don't like this brand. Like, to me, if you look at the theme that was approached within the last, I don't know how much of a Star Wars fan you are, by the way, but
I do enjoy them.
Right, okay, so in The Last Jedi, right, which is the most polarizing film in the series, the character Rey, you find out that she's a nobody, which is the way it should have stayed, in my opinion. But that's the theme, right?
Yeah.
That she's a nobody. And it's the theme that Star Wars originally had with Luke Skywalker, was a nobody. Eventually, then he became part of the, not royalty, but he's essentially part of the wider world because Darth Vader's his father. Spoiler alert, right? And they did that again. They kind of did it with Rey's character later on when they retconned that fact that she was a nobody. This is the theme they push for with here. These characters here have no connection to the bigger world other than themselves, And that's something that I think is like, again, like I say, people resist that. They're like, oh no, we want to feel what they were important, like that we got fate, that fate's pushing us forward, and that other people have faith in us. Actually, it's a lot harder to think, you know what? I'm not important unless I make myself important, which is something that this game really jumps for, which is probably, again, weirdly, why it probably is, it's this cult sort of film game as opposed to being as popular, because it's not as easy. That's the hard path, you know what I mean? That's the, there's no faith but what you make for yourself. Mentioning Terminator again, it's a really tricky kind of, this is like the pop culture episode, this one, isn't it? I mean, what else do I like as well? I mean, obviously, we could probably run down the list of the entire story and deep dive on it, but I think like we've probably touched upon the main themes of like their quest is to go and kick the Emperor's ass, essentially, or help the Resistance kick the Emperor's ass. And there's the themes that I think this starts off with, teenagers saving the world kind of stuff. The way that the mechanics of this game work, obviously, you have 4 players in the game, and you mentioned that the 4th character buggers off for some time. You are joined by multiple party members as you go through in this game. Most of them die. Spoiler alert.
Oh, yes.
Right? But they're all adult characters. And as young people, you help them along. Like it's this incredible sort of thing. I mean, I'm clearly clearly you can tell I'm a fan of this. Certainly the storytelling here. You're these nobody kids, and these people that have been damaged by the world, not look up to you, but they see you bring the best out of them as much as they bring the best out of you, which is just like probably the most human I think that the series has been. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, it kind of really smacks of that whole like jaded adult seeing youthful vitality and being like, yes, I was like that once, I can be like that again.
Totally.
Except not quite as hackneyed, I suppose.
No.
It's very much like, okay, well, we're all in this together. I've given up almost, but you guys haven't, and that's going to push me to become a better person. Like, I think ultimately it really feels like everyone's just kind of like slowly holding hands and becoming better people, and that in itself to me is more the fate of what they are. They're not necessarily great warriors of legend, they're not the warriors of light or anything like that, but they are fated to be a part of this world, a part of these communities and friendships that they're making along the way, and helping people to realize their best self, and in turn becoming their best selves too. It sounds a little bit cliched, but it was 88. I'm going to give it a pass.
I mean, I think to me, it feels less cheesy than some of the other stuff that's going on. It's not like I'm going to take on the forces of evil. No, I'm going to take on that nasty man that killed my family. You know what I mean? It's far more real. Other themes in this game, again, like I've pretty much written down a story summary here. We could go through the whole thing because there's lots to it, but that's not really what we're aiming for with this episode. I think like other highlights can, you get sent to go and find Joseph, who needs to help you but Joseph is being blackmailed because his daughter's being kept captive by Borgin. And it's like, okay,
Fucking
so
Borgin.
Morgan, what a Burke. And what's clever is that Joseph recognizes, well, I can't leave my post, but these guys look pretty capable. They can go and kick his ass and rescue Nellie, his daughter Nellie. Now, what's interesting about that, and again, I'd have to properly like delve into the story with that. There could be two sides to that where you look at that. You could either look at that like he reckons that they're the one hope that can do that, or maybe he thinks, well, maybe I'll send someone else to do my dirty work. You know, there could be an element of that as well, you know, in this war-torn world.
And I think that's something that absolutely can't be underappreciated either.
No.
Like in a world like this, in a setting like this, you can try and be the best person you can, but there are still going to be people who are not necessarily bad people that are not going to make the right choices. No. They are going to be selfish. They are going to be rude and ungainly and whatever else have you. And that's not even necessarily a bad thing. I know I've mentioned before how I tend to prefer media that takes itself a bit more seriously, that's a bit more grounded. And this really plays into that with the whole, is he doing it for personal gain or is he doing it because, you know, he really genuinely believes in these people? It's up to you to decide. And as someone who engages with and eats media like that, it really, really works for me. It really works.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that, again, another bit, I think it's Semet Falls that Joseph sends you to rescue Nellie. And while you're there rescuing Nellie, you're bearing in mind at this point, your sub-quest is to go and rescue Nellie. While you're there, you realize there's a bunch of other people being enslaved in the mines, and you rescue them, and you help rescue them. And that's a complete, like, not what you've been sent to do, but it's like, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You do that. And also there's a guy there called Paul the Thief.
Yes.
And what I love about this, right, and I remember this, like, I didn't remember this until I did some research. I went, oh my God, I remember this. Paul comes back later and rescues you. And it's this kind of like eye for an eye thing.
Yeah.
Is eye for an eye the right term in this instance?
It was exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, like literally, you do something nice for someone, they do something nice back to you, which is that kind of that the whole cusp of resistance is effectively the belief that the other person in front of you has good in them, effectively.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it there, like these people might be, you know, they've led a terrible life, they've been oppressed. What they're going to do is they're going to probably see the worst in everyone, and they're only going to act to their own interest because they can control that. Yeah. Someone comes along and puts trust in them, they can either betray that trust instantly or they can pay it back. And this goes to prove that actually this person, you rescued them earlier, he's come back to help you. That itself is the whole nature of resistance, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's that, and that's where I think that the Star Wars touched upon that as well. There's the whole plot point in Star Wars where this scoundrel Han Solo is, you know, out for himself, wants a reward, but Luke Skywalker's like, yeah, you know, you reckon you're all right, you're not too bad, and the princess is like, yeah, you're all right, and he comes back and rescues them at the end. It's that thing of like, actually, this person might be a bit of a knob on the outside, but actually maybe there's more to them. And that I think that scene of I think it's, oh God, what's his name? Paul coming in to rescue you in the prison later on is just to die for, I think.
Just playing off of that before I move into my next thought there was a quote from Sakaguchi to his team about Final Fantasy II, and I believe it was discussing like their work ethic and what was going to come after and stuff like that. And Sakaguchi essentially said, like, I don't want you to think about what comes after. I want you to put your entire soul into this game. I want you to put your blood, your sweat, everything goes into this. Don't save anything for what might come next. And I feel like that is kind of the theme of Final Fantasy II. Don't worry about tomorrow. Just do everything that you can now, here and now, because that's what matters, and hope that it comes out okay. And then when you have other things to deal with, we'll deal with that in the future. But the future is not now. It really feels like Sakaguchi just out there with the theme of Final Fantasy II, and I've been a fool to not see it all this time. So my next thought then, and I think this comes perfectly on the heels of all of that, what do you think of the Emperor as a villain?
So I think the Emperor as a villain, he is a one-dimensional piece of shit.
Yeah.
And I quite like villains like that.
See, normally I do as well. I kind of found myself really wanting a little bit more of the Emperor, and then I had to stop and think, the theme is, this courage and these sacrifices and these finding the good in people. As much as I like knowing the motivations of characters and why people are doing this, I don't think it's necessary for Final Fantasy II to operate the way that it does. I think it's fine that the Emperor just stays one note. He does have a backstory. It's a very limited one, and it's only found in the official novelization, which never made it outside of Japan. Why would we ever want official novelizations outside of Japan? I could take or leave it, honestly. I don't really think I care one way or another. The Emperor is the Emperor. He's just evil, and I'm fine leaving it that way.
Funny enough, I wasn't planning to reference Star Wars that much in this episode, but obviously there is definitely the comparison between the Emperor in Star Wars and the Emperor here. The Emperor in Star Wars is a Machiavellian character that knows everything that's going on and is playing a game of chess, effectively playing a game of chess with Obi-Wan Kenobi and losing in the long term until they brought that dreadful ninth movie out that never happened. But anyway, effectively, he's a clever character, and he's manipulated his way up the system to be in the position he's in. This Emperor is just out for himself, evil.
Yeah.
Obviously, that Emperor is as well, but in this instance, this is his biggest failing, that he just wants to just dominate the world. He hasn't got any depth. It's a different spin on it. The reason I quite like that type of villain, I mean, have you ever seen Guardians of the Galaxy?
The first one, yes.
The first Guardians of the Galaxy, Ronan the Accuser. Now, one of the things that the Marvel movies got hammered for, before they get hammered for everything now, before Thanos came along, was that the villains weren't very good, because they tended to be not very well written. Now, Ronan the Accuser got hammered as well, but I always thought he was great because he was just a religious zealot. And he was a very well, would say well written might be the word for it, but like a one-dimensional character, very well acted, very well performed. You know what he's about. This is his objective. This is what he's going to go for. Same with this guy. I mean, again, it doesn't make them jump to the top of any list as being an iconic villain, but it's a very well written archetype. It's kind of the angle I'm coming from.
So out of interest, do you know at all what the novelization gave to the Emperor? So apparently, and this is all stuff that I've gleaned off of the Final Fantasy wiki. So if anyone out there has read Mumen no Meikyu, please let me know if I've read this wrong or interpreted it wrong. But it stated that Palamecia as a location is cursed with demonic influences that corrupts the emperors specifically. The devil himself, so actual Satan, wants to rule the world by human proxy, and he turns all of the emperors into masterminds by essentially pulling a Zemus and just polluting their minds with like evil influence. The devil, I've got here written down, the devil originates all the way from the beginning of the world when he became trapped within the indestructible Stone of Eludia and swore revenge by any means. Now, the emperor, as we know him, his father was indicated to have been immune to Satan's influence, which resulted in Satan killing him via a heart attack. So I guess Satan has a fucking death note now. Right? So the emperor himself, who, by the way, is officially given the name Matthias or Matthias in the novelization, he is not immune whatsoever, and he sent his mother away rather than kill her at Satan's behest. She takes a big role in the novelization as like tracking down this stone that Satan sealed in and destroying it for good, I think. And ultimately, when the emperor is killed, when he comes back, it's not actually the emperor again, it is Satan taking his likeness. So you are actually fighting the devil rather than the emperor in the final battle, which is wild. I would expect no less from a Final Fantasy at this point, honestly.
Fighting to devil.
Yeah, right?
You fight the devil in 8 as well, but the devil becomes your friend. You tame the devil and he becomes yours. I mean, like the infamous line from this game is "Guy speak beaver." And what I like, I mean, that's obviously a meme. And I mentioned the beavers earlier in my reference, the fact that this is the Chronicles of Narnia. Because, of course, I mean, the mention in there is the fact that you've got 4 kids going around this world. It's snowy. And the fact one of you leaves and becomes part of the enemy. So Leon obviously becomes the Dark Knight. Spoiler alert. Not like Batman, like the Dark Knight. He's a Dark Knight character through the game, which ends up being your brother, and that's kind of what happens with Edmund in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, effectively. And this is why I think, oh my god, it's like, and there's beavers as well. I think there must be some influence. There got to be, surely.
I think you're really onto something with that. Actually.
Yeah. And of course, you meet the beavers, and then there's like, oh, Mr. Beaver, like from that really terrible BBC version that you must have seen as a kid. Like, oh, hey, Mr. Beaver, come to my dam. We don't look like beavers. Let's walk along here. And then, of course, Guy can speak beaver because Guy's backstory is that he was partly raised by animals, right? A bit silly, but like I think the point is that like, going off of that point before, like no matter how small a person you are in the grand scheme of things, you might have a skill that someone else hasn't got. Yeah. That's the point. The point is that like you are useful because of your own individual thing. And that's what they're going for with that. And I think, I mean, again, it's cheesy, but that works really, really. That's it. Like, how can we do this? Let's put beavers in it. It's a bit silly, but like it's really, really cool. And of course, there's this like overarching theme of like, again, like influencing people as you go. You meet what's his name? Ricard the Dragoon. You meet him in the belly of the Leviathan.
Man of legend.
Yeah, one absolute
Love Richard.
star. Yeah, is it Ricard or Richard? Like, I mean, it
It's
depends on what
it's
version you
supposed
played,
to
I
be
think.
Richard,
Yeah.
but I believe because of, again, character limitations, it had to be
Yeah.
Ricard.
Yeah, it's got Ricard the Dragoon.
Did you know that with the first English translation in the Origins port, the names were transliterated differently?
Oh, were they? Oh, God.
So we have issues to this day whether or not his name is Firion or Fironiel, which is just such a fucking mouthful to say.
Gus as well, wasn't it?
Yes, Gus was originally Guy. Leon was originally Leon Hart. Again, you can see where we really would run out of characters with that one. Minhu was the biggest, I think, target of this. I've seen his name written about 50 different ways. The way that I write it, I've never seen anyone else write it. Richard was renamed Gareth, which could not be less similar if it tried. Now, I don't know about you, but Gareth Highwind just doesn't sound right.
Gareth Highwind. No, I'm imagining Gareth Southgate kicking the football now. Missing a penalty. And anyway, sorry. Yeah, no, Gareth. Yeah, that doesn't right. Richard has like Richard the Lionheart. I mean, even though Richard the Lionheart was a dick, like Richard the Lionheart has that more synonymous with like a warrior.
Yeah.
I mean, there is so much to dig into with this one. We could definitely do a deep dive on this one at some point, which we keep saying in every episode. Let's do a deep dive at some point. Eventually, we'll get around to it. I mean, I think I will touch upon. There's a part as well where you meet. Is it Leela or Layla? I can never pronounce it. Obviously, it's written down.
I've always said Layla.
Layla's pirate crew. I think the pirates appear in the first game, but you get pirates here, and you want to go and recruit wyverns, and you bump into Layla's pirate crew, kick her ass, and then she realizes that she responds to the fact you're powerful. And again, that's another theme here. Like when you win different people over depending on how you act with them. So effectively, you win over Hilda early on by finding the ring from someone that she cared about. You were clearly brave enough to do that, so you've shown your bravery. Here, you show your strength to win someone over. So it's learning how to deal with individuals within the world, which is really the big theme of it. And I just love the idea of the fact that the wyvern, when you show yourself to the wyvern, that sounds really creepy. When you meet the last wyvern, the wyvern entrusts you with the wyvern egg that you put in the lake, which then comes back later. It's just so cool. And again, synonymous with the resistance, isn't it? Because like that, I certainly don't remember how deep they went with it, but my thought of when playing it was that it was kind of the one thing the Empire never thought about, because they thought they'd wiped the wyverns out. So effectively, you have the situation where, oh my god, there's one left, and it's like fucks their day up. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? I've got to get rid of these monsters that can kill me. Better get them all, because one of them will come back and be vengeful against you. That kind of thing.
I do have one other thing to mention here, and it was about the magic and how it was still kind of buggy in Final Fantasy II, the way that it was kind of buggy in Final Fantasy I. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but there were some spells that just straight up did not work in the NES and Famicom versions. It was fixed in later iterations and ports. But yeah, if you're playing the original and you're wondering why Temper doesn't work, it's because it just won't. So give up. In Final Fantasy II, the spell Dispel just does not work whatsoever. Yeah, I know, right?
Lol.
And my personal favorite here is that Protect doesn't affect anybody except the person casting it. So if you're trying to protect someone else, yeah, you just fucking give up on it. I know, ridiculous. But here, I have noted down that when 2 originally came out in the Famicom, Ultima, which is the ultimate spell, you might imagine, it's the one that one character sacrifices themselves to achieve, so that the resistance actually has some kind of power to fight back with. It's bloody difficult to acquire, and it was useless on the Famicom. Originally, it was initially meant to increase its power relative to the level of other spells, but because of a bug, it only did around 500 damage at most on a single target. Sakaguchi has actually said, relating to this bug, when Square tested the game and saw it, Sakaguchi himself asked for it to be fixed. The person who programmed it replied that legendary stuff that dates back to an age before proper techniques would look inferior from the present's point of view to explain its weakness. He reasoned that the struggle to acquire it only to discover its useless mirrors real life, so he wasn't going to fix it. Sakaguchi was like, fucking fix it, what are you talking about? And tried to fix it himself. The programmer had made it so that he couldn't. Ultima was left the way that it was, and that is why Ultima sucks in the Famicom version of Final Fantasy II.
It's Ultima's first appearance, though, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Presumably it's a reference to the Ultima games.
That's a good point, actually. I don't know. I would be surprised if they didn't include little Easter eggs like that. Like you mentioned earlier, Here Lies Link from Final Fantasy I.
Yeah.
It's almost a shame that we don't get those little nods in modern games these days.
interesting on that. I mean, obviously, like the only thing that I've got to add there are like again, is we could either go like down a rabbit hole and talk about every single aspect of this game, or Kane is in this game.
Yes.
So not probably not the same Kane, but
no, it's very interesting considering that the West got Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II, because obviously we didn't get Final Fantasy II until 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
The amount of tiny little continuity nods almost between 2 and 4, like the place of Mysidia and Richard and Kane, like the two worlds are not connected whatsoever at all, but it's so nice to think that they almost could have been, you know?
Yeah, totally. But I mean, my take on it was interesting because, like, effectively, if you play this game first, like naturally, if you were Japanese and playing it, you would go, "Oh, that's a throwback to that game." Whereas if you were to play 2 afterwards, like most people in the West did, you would feel like, "Oh, that's an homage to the wonderful character."
It's a throw forward.
Yeah, it's this really weird, bizarre kind of thing. The only other thing I want to mention is the fact that Leon, I mean, we talked about Star Wars. Leon's basically Darth Vader in this game, isn't he? You know, we talked about Edmund from Lion Witch the Wardrobe, but you know, you effectively you bring him back to your side because his sister is part of the team. It's Maria and Leon. You know, she sees the good in him and brings him back to the light. And of course, the end, spoiler alert, he decides to go his own way, and you may meet again. Which probably leaves this game as the most needing of a sequel, I think, because
no, let's not say the word sequel. We don't need to know if you found personal atonement or not. Let's just remake the damn thing from the ground up, and then they can just keep going.
That's what I was pushing for. Someone doesn't like sequels, or
hey, now I defended Final Fantasy X too, like hell last time.
Final Fantasy II compilation. Imagine what that would be like.
Oh god,
flip phones in Final Fantasy II on motorbikes. That'd be really cool, wouldn't it? Imagine that.
I don't have a response to that one.
Imagine Guy coming out of like a podium singing "What Can I Do For You" with beavers.
Jesus Christ.
Right, okay, I think that's probably time for a quick break, and we'll be back shortly to talk about our wildcard subjects for this episode. See you in a bit. Okay, we are back after a short break, and we are going to be talking about our wildcard subjects for this episode. You already kind of know what mine is. So my wildcard subject is 8-bit theatre and other stuff surrounding 8-bit theatre. So you mentioned 8-bit theatre before. It was one of the first sprite comics. Started in March 2001, the very early days of the internet. You know, it was a lot easier to get on the internet and produce content. Started by Brian Clevenger, I believe the name. Website was nuclearpower.com. I know he went on to do other stuff. I think he's done some stuff for Marvel and stuff over the years from what I can see, but he got his start in this. Now, it was a parody of the first Final Fantasy game and utilized assets from the NES version of the game. Now, one of the reasons he decided to go for the sprite-based comic was that he didn't feel he had the drawing skills necessary to produce his own comic, which I find very, very interesting. But he would tweak them and he would make his own background. So it wasn't like he was, completely jumping them. Now, obviously, this was massively influential. There were lots and lots of other sprite comics that came out around the same time. Presumably, I mean, I'd love to dig into this as well, but presumably it was because those sprites were easier to get on the internet. Like images were the thing on the internet back in the day. Obviously video couldn't be embedded quite the same way. It probably could, but it would take about 8 billion years to load.
At least you'd be able to let the videos buffer. I remember those days. YouTube, bring it back. YouTube.
Yeah, I remember before ads, YouTube. No, anyway, I don't know if it's fair to say he started a movement or anything like that, but there were lots of people that were copycatting this and moving on with stuff like that.
Yeah.
Now, what's very interesting about this is that clearly an American production, they were nostalgic for Final Fantasy 1. Now, obviously, we talked about before, this comic started before we'd even got Final Fantasy 1. I think at this point in Europe.
God, that's a really good point, actually.
In Europe, all we had was Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, and I think we knew 10 was coming out. And the Spirits
we would have had
Within
Tactics as well.
I don't think we had Tactics till later.
Oh, really? Okay.
Nope. I think we never got Tactics on PS1. So we knew these things were happening. We knew that there was obviously more than older Final Fantasy games. I think maybe 6 might have come out. I'm not sure about that. I'm going to have to check the date.
I could have sworn Tactics was out on PSX.
Tactics came out on PSX, but I don't know if it came out in Europe. You might be right. You've played Tactics, so you might be right on that. But effectively, we didn't have much of a series compared to even the States, which had not as much as Japan, obviously. Now, I found that fascinating because I got into 8-bit theatre through Flash animation, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the Flash animation stuff from 8-bit theatre. So that started in 2002 on Newgrounds, as far as I can see. I believe it was probably on other websites as well, but Newgrounds is where I saw it. And essentially, it was you look at the comment now that's still on YouTube, on Newgrounds, which just says, by the way, I've got permission. By the way, I've got permission. What's fascinating from looking at that particular page on Newgrounds is that even in 2024, people are still commenting on it, saying how important it is. It's got over 1 million views on a Flash website, right?
Wow.
Don't know how that compares. Obviously, 1 million views on YouTube is a big deal, but I don't know how that compares on a Flash site compares to everything else that's on it, that should we say. So it's still something people will revisit every now and then. Interestingly, there's only, I think, 5 maybe episodes were produced of it. It was voice acted and it was loosely animated. I mean, it was effectively using the sprites and the way they were set up from the webcomic, which is obviously like a static image. One page, they'd put about 6 or 7 of those together and move the story forward through that. What's interesting about, I think you touched upon this before briefly, what is interesting about 8-Bit Theatre is that it's basically a joke, which is we mentioned before that the Light Warriors were effectively like this prophetic bunch of kids that want to save the world. The joke with this, the overarching joke, was that these were the worst possible people that could want to save the world because they were all assholes. You know, you mentioned in the last episode, you talked about Drakengard, and you talked about how they were the worst people in the world, and isn't it awful? And you know, I think the phrase you used was, "You don't need to be." What was it? Something like
you don't need to be evil to kill people. You just have to think you're right.
Right. Okay. So that phrase, and thank you. Moving on from that phrase as well, and effectively the inverse of that would be, you don't necessarily have to be a good person to do the right thing. Would be probably the flip side of that. It's not quite as deep and as dark as that. It's just a jokey parody that actually and the joke is there is like, well, you're the fated people that save the world. I mean, if someone said that to me, I'd be like, am I? Oh, am I really? Like, it's only because it's kind of like, because you believe in me kind of thing. There's an episode of, I talk about this quite a lot as well. There's an episode of Recess where TJ, the main character, is off school and he's had a broken arm. He's coming with his arm in a sling, and everyone makes this legendary story up about all these things he's done, got him this broken arm. And he's like, he doesn't say anything. He's like, I got a broken arm, blah, blah, blah. And by the end of the episode, they're all saying, oh, he's killed someone. He had to fight someone off. He had to do this. He's just saved a cat from a lake. All sorts of different things he said. I don't remember the exact things that were said. And at the end of the episode, he turns around and goes, I went square dancing and I didn't want to do it. And I was embarrassed about it, so I didn't tell anyone. So this like myth built up around him. And that's kind of the joke with Hiss here, you know, funny enough, came out around the same time. These people are this myth. And we're like, okay, whatever. You know, yeah, we're the Light Warriors, this kind of thing. You know, you've got the characters which are Black Mage Evil Wizardington.
God, is that his full name?
Yes, that's his full name. Who is a sadistic character who uses any excuse to burn and blow things up. Fighter McWarrior, who's basically the dumbest person alive. Now that trope, interestingly, presumably moved forward into Brentalfloss's song. Have you familiar with Brentalfloss?
No, I'm not.
you got world of fun. Brentalfloss is a guy that does like Weird Al style stuff in a sense. He basically takes video game music and then sings off. It's what if this had lyrics, right? Okay. So he's done one for Final Fantasy VII, which is funny, but there's one called Ballad of the Mages, which I would most definitely recommend watching. And it's effectively using lots of the music from Final Fantasy I, and it's singing along to it. I didn't mention it till now because it ties more in with this than it does with the main story of Final Fantasy I. And of course, in that one, there are puppets which do the voices of the other characters from the game, but he plays the warrior and he's dumb. And he's like, oh, you know, he isn't dumb, but he's like doing this silly face and he's dumb. The trope that let's turn the fighter into being the most useless dumb person ever was kind of synonymous with that, I guess. We have the Prince of Elfland, which is the thief, who's competent but completely driven by his own interest, kind of like Zidane is in Final Fantasy IX as well. And Red Mage as Stat Kowalski, I believe, who is driven to get the best stats possible and treats the world he's in like an actual game. The Flash version obviously came out in 2002, a little bit time afterwards. There were also other Flash animations that came out around the time. This was a massive influence on me, and I loved revisiting this. It was the Final Fighting Fantasy, which pitched the Final Fantasy IV characters against the Final Fantasy I characters, which at the time would have been the Final Fantasy II characters for the sort of American audience. And that, obviously, there was several episodes of that, and they brought in other characters, and there's loads of different parodies. There's a few on there that had some really, really surreal things on that I can't really find anymore. They've probably been lost to the annals of time. But that was a big thing. And I dabbled a little bit on myself. I'd get the sprite sheets off. I would cut them out.
Sprite sheets.
Yeah,
that
sprite
takes
sheets.
me back.
Cut them out and make little animations of Flash Mine were never that good. But there was loads of there was basically, you had the more serious ones where people would try and tie together the story characters from Final Fantasy, any of the 8-bit, 16-bit characters. And then there would also be the silly parodies like 8-bit Theatre. My favorite one was 8-bit D&D.
Okay.
Are you familiar with 8-bit D&D?
I'm not, no.
Right, so 8-bit D&D was inspired by 8-bit Theatre. It even says that on the page. And it used a D&D skit created by the Dead Ale Wives, which was released in 1996, which is effectively like a live, impromptu, silly comedy thing. And it's effectively nothing to do with Final Fantasy or sprites or anything like that. It's basically, I presume it's audio only, of a bunch of guys sat around joking about, oh, you know, like different characters like that. Some of the quotes were, I want to cast magic missile at the darkness. Roll the dice to see if I'm getting drunk. And where's the Cheetos are probably three of the best lines in it. It's about 5 minutes long. So effectively they use that and then they put it to the characters from 8-Bit Theatre sitting around the table playing a game of D&D. Well worth watching if you've got 5 minutes to waste, because it's just really, really funny. And of course, you know, it's got some silly, like, quirky naughties humor in it. It's harmless though. There's nothing offensive in that really.
I think I know what I'm going to be sending to my D&D group in a couple of hours.
It's rather worth watching. And that's my favorite one, because I remember watching that and thinking, this is really cool. Like they actually had the characters sitting down at the table and there's guys saying, I want to have grey eyes. I want to have grey eyes. Actually, you've got blue eyes according to the sheet I've given you. And you can just see how frustrated the dungeon master is getting with the people sat around him. And there's one person in the kitchen saying, where are the Cheetos? More concerned. It's a parody of people playing board games in a social setting, probably even games, you could argue as well, and done with the 8-bit piece of art, I think. I mean, in my opinion, I think massively influential on me, and I thought I really want to do more stuff like that. Now I'm sat here on a Final Fantasy podcast talking about it, so I guess I did something right. So I've written here, I dabbled in some Flash stuff myself before YouTube killed it, so it's important to my creative history as well as its influence on my Final Fantasy exposure, because of course that's what really got me into all of the older games that didn't exist at that point, because I was probably watching these maybe in 2002, probably before we were getting these older games, or at least around the time anyway. So that's kind of my brief interlude into the Final Fantasy parody world. There is a lot more to it, and I would love to talk about it in the future, but they're the ones that are sprite based. And I thought, well, it makes sense to be a wildcard topic, but it kind of deserves its own topic area, really.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with that. I think my favorite thing, because I do remember keeping up with 8-Bit Theatre while it was still going, because I was reading it before it finished, and I dropped off reading it before it had finished even. So when I found out that it had not only finished, but it had like a fully illustrated epilogue, it was like, oh my God. And then to find out that it was a fucking brick joke from 9 years prior, like, Brian Clevenger is a clever kind of dude, let's say. It's a good payoff. I don't necessarily think that it would pay off as well as it did 14 years ago, but he did a damn good job. And I'm more impressed than anything that he kept it up for so long. Like, 9 years is not a small amount of time to be doing a webcomic for, even if it isn't art that you're drawing. And he kept it funny the whole time as well.
Yeah.
I do seem to remember, like, you know, okay, there was a plot, and there were things that harkened back to earlier episodes, and maybe it still was a little simple in the style of Final Fantasy 1, but ultimately it wasn't that, you know, it wasn't nothing. There was a plot. The characters had characterization, even if that was sword chucks and burning everyone alive. It was it's definitely a product of its time, and I don't think it's something that can be overlooked, actually. It's definitely a read.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's interesting that you're talking about the reading flip through webcomic version. Obviously, I read a bits of that, but to me, it was about the Flash animation. I mean, there wasn't much of it adapted. It's probably the first 20 or so bits. I remember there's a point where they go into a town, and I think it's the Black Mage is trying to impress the White Mage, and uses the line, "Baby, you must be tired because you've been running through my mind all day." Like that, I remember that's the first time I was exposed to that particular chat up line. Not that I've ever used that chat up line, but let's put it that way. But like, there was loads of stuff like that, which was just so, like I say, I mean, it's naughty humor. The joke was always, there were the occasional like this guy trying to impress a woman stuff, but the joke was always on the person himself. There's some of that stuff in 8-bit D&D as well. Probably, I mean, I'd have to delve through all of it, but it's probably aged quite well in a sense as well. It's not necessarily that offensive. There's probably stuff in there that might be a bit like, ooh, I guess be worth having a look at. I think I'll touch upon it briefly. I don't know how, again, it's something I'd love to delve into and pick apart the history of it, but of course, Newgrounds was somewhere I spent a lot of my time as a teenager. And I remember specifically about 8-bit theatre thinking was that it was funded and it got money off the back of it. And I don't know if it completely was the only thing he did, but I remember thinking, wow, you can make something that's daft and silly. It's good, but you're doing something you like and you're making money off of doing it. You've also created this world where everyone else can also do that, you know, and it felt like this unlimited creative place.
Yeah. I guess there wasn't really a lot of similar, like, now that I'm thinking about it, just the landscape really has changed so much, hasn't it? And in such a short amount of time too. Like 30 years ago even, you would never have imagined that you could make money or a career even off of doing stuff like sitting down and talking about what other people have created. And
totally.
Yet here we are.
Yeah, here we
Not that
are.
this is necessarily a career, but
No, exactly. It stuck with me. It's something that I really, really enjoyed looking through. I forgot how influential it was on me. Actually, I remember, like, again, I don't think I read the whole story to its conclusion, but I think what it reminded me actually was of that, is the fact that, like, I said, the main thing for me was the Flash movies, and there's only 5 of them, so you could probably watch all of it within less than an hour. So, and I thought to myself, well, actually, something like that, only so short, had an impact on me, and it was a massively important thing to me. I didn't have to spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours researching it. That made me think, hang on a minute, like, encourage me to do more of this kind of stuff we're doing here. To, don't beat yourself up. Just like, you've got something to say it and see what happens. Clearly, what this guy did. Yeah, thanks, Brian. He seems like an all right dude.
See if we can get him on in the future.
That would be cool. I would really, probably really cry, cool, to be honest with you. But anyway, yes. Would you like to talk about your topic? That's all I've got to say on that for now.
Yes, so in keeping with old sprite work and stuff that came out on the Famicom, today my wildcard topic is going to be talking about Sailor Moon. Now, Jack,
wow,
what do you know about Sailor Moon?
I played the theme song on one of my channels, the guitar theme song, which I love. What do I know about Sailor Moon? I remember it being a thing. I don't have many memories of following the story. I remember it kind of being like the girls' version of Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah.
Was certainly how it was. I don't know if it was necessarily how it was marketed, but it was certainly how it felt at the time. I do remember the artwork being around a lot. I remember people having lunch boxes of it, and I know that there was censorship where I believe 2 of the Sailor Moon characters were actually a couple, but because of the Western sensibilities, they had to be changed to they were cousins or something like that. And there's a cute cat, 2 cute cats in it.
Yeah. There's 3 cute cats.
There's 3 cute cats.
There's 3 cute cats.
And of course, Fighting Evil by Moonlight. Was it Moonlight Densetsu is the original theme?
That's correct. Yes.
And there's also the dubbed version, which was effectively the same melody but with different stuff. Quite a lot of them were Pokemon, I think, and that's cool.
Were you aware that Sailor Moon actually has multiple video games?
No.
Comes as no surprise, really, does it? How many video games do you reckon there are?
You've even a reverse card me when I've been talking about Dragon Ball Z, haven't you?
I have.
I have no idea, if I'm totally honest with you, but I presume they're all really obscure things that came out on the SNES and flipping PlayStation 1 and stuff like that.
Pretty much, yeah. Listed on Wikipedia, the total amount of Sailor Moon only games, and this isn't including Sailor Moon being included in like other IPs as like guest characters or anything, counts at 36, which is not an insignificant amount. 8 of those are trivia or puzzle games. 13 of those are either fighting games or side-scrolling beat-em-ups, which is the last thing that anyone would associate with Sailor Moon. But by God, there's a lot of them out there.
What?
Oh yeah, you can just straight up wail on other Sailor Senshi. However, there is one in particular that I want to talk about, which was the only RPG that was ever produced for the franchise, and it's known as Sailor Moon: Another Story. Now, this came out for the SNES in 1995. It's actually set between the 3rd and 4th seasons of the plot. Now, the anime and the manga are very similar, but take slightly different story beats. The anime consists of overall 200 episodes. There's a fair amount of filler. It gives you a lot of chance to actually interact with the Sailor Senshi and learn more about them. It turns from less of a plot-driven thing to a character-driven thing, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does take some creative liberties, shall we say, with the stuff that's going on, which is to say nothing of the final season, which was changed drastically in the anime from how the original manga plot actually goes, but that's neither here nor there. So, set between the 3rd and 4th seasons, now, Sailor Moon goes the way of there is a big evil that's threatening Juban Tokyo, and the Sailor Senshi are the ones that are going to save the day. By the end of the season, either they die or a bunch of other people die or some unspeakable horror happens, but it's okay because Sailor Moon saves the day, and then there's a period of recovery before you go into the next season and the unending horrors and tragedies strike again. And this leans into that. It's essentially a whole extra story which uses the original source material while giving it a fresh lick of paint. It's a top-down isometric RPG, the same way that Chrono Trigger and the early Final Fantasies were, with random encounters, a battle screen. It even has multiple endings. There are 2 based on which party that you defeat the final boss with. It also, similar to Chrono Trigger, which came out the same year, introduces combination attacks between your party and unique victory poses. So rather than just the standard cheering up and down that the Final Fantasy sprites do, Sailor Moon: Another Story is actually a little bit more advanced than that. The plot is from the 30th century, which is this is something that actually is referenced quite a lot within the actual anime and manga itself. There is a sorceress that arrives with her group of girls that are the Oppositio Guardians and has ordered them to alter the past to change the future to her liking. So it's a time travel story, essentially.
No.
And ultimately, it's up to you as the Sailor Senshi to defeat these girls and eventually this sorceress who you know very, very little about. It's surprisingly robust, actually. So it includes all of the Sailor Senshi as characters that you can actually have in your battle formation, including different linking up attacks that you can do with duos, trios, and occasionally the entire group of 5 that you can have in the party. It sends you across the world. Yes, that's right, the real world, because Sailor Moon is set in Japan. The inner Senshi are actually sent out into the wider world at some point to find magical items. So when you look up another story's world maps, this means that you get things like the map of Switzerland, the map of Tokyo. I know, it's wild. It was unfortunately, as the way of so many good things, never translated or localized from Japan. It was Japan exclusive.
Of course.
There was a fan translation that was done in 1999, which is the version that I have played. It's serviceable, although it does do the thing of a lot of 90s and early noughties translations of keeping a lot of original Japanese names and not explaining them. So if you don't know what the Ginzui show is, then you're fucked. You know, you're never going to intuit that. However, there was a new translation done in 2019, which I believe does actually clear up some of those issues and is a little bit more in keeping with the actual like characters, just overall like bearings and speech patterns and things like that. It's a good RPG, actually. I really enjoyed playing through it, not just because I enjoy Sailor Moon. Obviously I do, or I wouldn't have played it at all. It might not necessarily be for everyone because of the source material, but as a game, it stands up pretty decently on its own. You know, it has a decent battle system. It's fairly similar to Pokemon in the sense of you have a limited amount of times that you can use attacks before you have to refresh point system, I suppose. Things that I find really, really adorable, actually. All of the items, rather than potions and ethers and things like that, you have real world items that you can use. So you can heal 10 health using orange juice, for example. But that also means that you just get some absolutely wild things like pork chops, which fixes petrify.
Right.
If you ever see a person that's turned to stone, just slap them with a pork chop, it'll get the job done.
What waste of a pork chop?
Or confetti. Using confetti will permanently increase your attack, as we all know. Overall, it's a cute little game. It's really good. If you enjoy the show and the characters already, this gives you a little bit more towards that in the way that the anime might not, or the manga just does not extrapolate on. Again, not necessarily for everyone, but the sprite work, in my opinion, at least for the bosses and the random encounters, which all, other than the big bad, there are no new encounters. It's all stuff that you will recognize from either the manga or from the anime series. So there's nothing out of place there. And the sprite work is absolutely gorgeous. They are big battle sprites, the same way that like the battle sprites in 4 are big as far as bosses, with your party small on the right. So if you know RPGs, or at least classic RPGs, you know how they play, you're not going to find anything that's out of the ordinary in this one. Worth a look in if you want to play, honestly.
Sounds interesting. I've always wanted to get into Sailor Moon.
I wouldn't necessarily say that another story is a good place to start. No. But honestly, if you know the basics of, you know, there are 10 girls who save the world using love and justice, and also they wear sailor fukus, and some of them have elemental attacks, you know, it's not particularly deep. I love Sailor Moon, but I'm not gonna be the person that's like, it's got berserk levels of obscurity behind it.
No, it's interesting because, like, obviously, again, it's something I probably would have watched as a kid. I mean, like I said in a previous episode, I was never like, oh, that's girly, I can't touch it. I watched Card Captors a lot, or Card Captors Sakura. Yeah, as it was originally called, but obviously it was changed as Card Captors in the West and made a bit more boy-y, or whatever you want to call it. I watched that, and that was it was obviously even like with the change, it was like clearly a magical girl show. Yeah. Funny enough, on that, I remember this pops up every now and then when I think of Card Captors. The movie came out on VHS back in the day. Ooh. And the VHS for that movie was like, you know, remember the old holofoil, like Pokemon cards thing? Yeah. And it was bright pink.
Oh God.
So me and my mate were really into it, and we were like, how do we get, and it was like he had to like buy it, but like smuggle it out of Asda. so we didn't like didn't look really girly, like because like, oh, big pink thing. Like we were only like 10 or 11, you know what I mean? Like, so wouldn't care now. But like yeah, no, like but obviously like that's card captors, and that was my exposure to sort of magical girl stuff, which was great. You know, like, the way I look at it, as long as it was a good story and it was enjoyable, I wouldn't have cared. And like I think with Sailor Moon though, I don't think there was any like aversion to watching. I just didn't know when it was on or where it was played.
That's fair enough.
It was hard. It was like it wasn't like as rammed down our throats like Pokemon was, or and it wasn't as easily accessible as Dragon Ball Z became. And I know Digimon was on Fox Kids. It was celebrated a lot more. Sailor Moon seemed to be that like one that was tucked away somewhat. Don't know why.
No, I'll agree with that. Actually, Sailor Moon was one of those things that a lot of my friends in school were aware of, but didn't necessarily watch. And it took until I was about 14 to know what it was. Really, I'd heard the name, but I didn't know anything more about that. Which, considering the same way that Goku is kind of like his face, you know what Sailor Moon looks like, totally. And to know nothing else about that is kind of bizarre thinking about it.
I know that I don't know any of the characters. Other than there's like Sailor Jupiter and all the different sailors. Yes. But I know that there's the villain, or is he the villain with the mask?
Oh no, I know
he's in the theme song.
No, he's a good guy.
He's a good guy because there's a parody series called Medabots, and the villain in that wears the same mask. Now, okay. Medabots was an interesting one. That's definitely a topic for another day. But Medabots was supposed to be a parody, but of course, because we didn't get everything until later, they just tried to sell it as a normal anime. Like, and I know that there's like a shopkeeper in that. There's obviously the same guy, and he has a similar looking getup in that. So I'm just assuming it was a parody of that. And I've always thought, oh yeah, it's definitely the same thing. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just missing something. Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Again, you did definitely in a reverse card me there with Dragon Ball Z, didn't you? So. You're going to get me to watch Sailor Moon now, aren't you?
Oh god, I honestly wouldn't recommend it. About 50% of it is filler.
Same with Dragon Ball, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, fair enough then. Go for it, fuck it.
Well, no. Like so, Dragon Ball, like again, obviously we mentioned before, like there are so many games to do with Dragon Ball, and the thing is about them, like they all retell the same story. Right. So you get the story through the games quite easily. I wouldn't recommend a new viewer watch. I'd recommend the new viewer watches the original Dragon Ball series because it was running a long time, the same time as the manga, and it was keeping a relatively good pace. Of course, then it became a lot more popular, and of course, then it became a lot more filler-tastic. The original, I think, interestingly, the Dragon Ball manga was 42 volumes, I believe. Okay. So the whole thing, that includes Dragon Ball Z. The first section, which is Dragon Ball, was the first 16 volumes. Now, comparatively, in terms of episodes, the anime had 150 episodes. But the anime of Dragon Ball Z, which was volumes 17 through 42, had 291.
Jesus Christ.
Twice as many episodes for not twice as many volumes.
That's insane. Okay.
Twice as many episodes for 1.4 as many episodes or something like that. So like it does get really filler heavy. Yeah, if there's another way to consume that series, I'd do it. I'd be a lot more inclined to do that because it would be great to watch that sort of thing. Right, okay, that's it for this episode. Did you enjoy this more? Because I did.
I did, actually. It was really nice to go back right to the very beginning of the series and think about them in a way that I haven't really given them the same kind of time of day that other games have been given.
Totally. Cool. Brilliant. Okay, thank you to everyone else for listening. You can find me on Twitter as JackMollen8 and on YouTube as the Two Random Words Productions. What about yourself, Mol?
I can be found on Twitter at Atramalek.
Fantastic. Cool. See you later, everyone. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye-bye.